Book 2, Chapter 4 of My Own Story by Emmeline Pankhurst. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. 4 Years of Peaceful Militancy. Chapter 8. Almost immediately after the events chronicled in the preceding chapter, I sailed for my second tour through the United States. I was delighted to find a thoroughly alive and progressive suffrage movement, where before had existed with most people only an academic theory in favor of equal political rights between men and women. My first meeting, held in Brooklyn, was advertised by sandwich women walking through the principal streets of the city, quite like our militant suffragists at home. Street meetings, I found, were now daily occurrences in New York. The Women's Political Union had adopted an election policy, and throughout the country as far west as I traveled, I found women awakened to the necessity of political action instead of mere discussion of suffrage. My second visit to America, like my first one, is clouded in my memory with sorrow. Very soon after my return to England, a beloved sister, Mrs. Mary Clark, died. My sister, who was a most ardent suffragist and a valued worker in the Women's Social and Political Union, was one of the women who was shockingly maltreated in Parliament Square on Black Friday. She was also one of the women who, a few days later, registered their protest against the government by throwing a stone through the window of an official residence. For this act she was sent to Holloway Prison for a term of 1 month. Released on December 21st, it was plain to those who knew her best that her health had suffered seriously from the dreadful experience of Black Friday and the after experience of prison. She died suddenly on Christmas Day, to the profound sorrow of all her associates. Hers was not the only life that was sacrificed as a result of that day. Other deaths occurred, mostly from hearts weakened by overstrain. Mrs. Henria Williams died on January 2, 1911, from heart failure. Mrs. Cecilia Woolsey Haig was another victim. Ill treatment on Black Friday resulted in her case in a painful illness which ended, after a year of intense suffering, in her death on December 21, 1911. It is not possible to publish a full list of all the women who have died or have been injured for life in the course of the suffrage agitation in England. In many cases the details have never been made public, and I do not feel at liberty to record them here. A very celebrated case, which is public property, is that of Lady Constance Lytton, sister of the Earl of Lytton, who acted as chairman of the Conciliation Committee. Lady Constance had twice in 1909 gone to prison as a result of suffrage activities, and on both occasions had been given special privileges on account of her rank and family influence. In spite of her protests and her earnest pleadings to be accorded the same treatment as other suffrage prisoners, the snobbish and cowardly authorities insisted in retaining Lady Constance in the hospital cells and discharging her before the expiration of her sentence. This was done on a plea of her ill health, and it was true that she suffered from a valvular disease of the heart. Smarting under the sense of the injustice done her comrades in this discrimination, Lady Constance Lytton did one of the most heroic deeds to be recorded in the history of the suffrage movement. She cut off her beautiful hair and otherwise disguised herself, put on cheap and ugly clothing, and as Jane Warton took part in a demonstration at Newcastle, again suffering arrest and imprisonment. This time the authorities treated her as an ordinary prisoner. Without testing her heart or otherwise giving her an adequate medical examination, they subjected her to the horrors of forcible feeding. Owing to her fragile constitution, she suffered frightful nausea each time, and when on one occasion the doctor's clothing was soiled, he struck her contemptuously on the cheek. This treatment was continued until the identity of the prisoner suddenly became known. She was, of course, immediately released, but she never recovered from the experience, and is now a hopeless invalid. I want to say right here that those well-meaning friends on the outside who say that we have suffered these horrors of prison, of hunger strikes and forcible feeding, because we desire to martyrize ourselves for the cause, are absolutely and entirely mistaken. We never went to prison in order to be martyrs. We went there in order that we might obtain the rights of citizenship. We were willing to break laws that we might force men to give us the right to make laws. That is the way the men have earned their citizenship. Truly says Mazzini that the way to reform has always led through prison. The result of the general election, which took place in January 1911, was that the Liberal Party was again returned to power. Parliament met on January 31st, but the session formally opened on February 6th with the reading of the King's speech. The programme for the session included the Lords' veto measure, Home Rule, payment for members of Parliament, and the abolishment of plural voting. Invalid insurance was also mentioned, and certain amendments to the Old Age Pension Bill. Women's suffrage was not mentioned. Nevertheless, we were singularly lucky, the first 3 places in the ballot being secured by members of the Conciliation Committee. Mr. Phillips, an Irish member, drew the first place, but as the Irish party had decided not to introduce any bills that session, he yielded to Sir George Kemp, who announced that he would use his place for the purpose of taking a second reading debate on the new Conciliation Bill. The old bill had been entitled "A Bill to Give the Vote to Women Occupiers," a title that made amendment difficult. The new bill bore the more flexible title, "A Bill to Confer the Parliamentary Franchise on Women," thus doing away with one of Mr. Lloyd George's most plausible objections to it. The £10 occupation clause was omitted, doing away with another objection, that of the possibility of faggot voting, that is, of a rich man conferring the vote on a family of daughters by the simple expedient of making them tenants of slices of his own property. The Conciliation Bill now read: 1. Every woman possessed of a household qualification within the meaning of the Representation of the People Act, 1844, shall be entitled to be registered as a voter, and when registered to vote in the county or borough in which the qualified premises are situated. 2. For the purposes of this Act, a woman shall not be disqualified by marriage for being registered as a voter, provided that a husband and wife shall not both be registered as voters in the same parliamentary borough or county division. This bill met with even warmer approval than the first one, because it was believed that it would win votes from those members who felt that the original measure had fallen short of being truly democratic. Nevertheless, the Prime Minister showed from the first that he intended to oppose it, as he had all previous suffrage measures. He announced that all Fridays up to Easter, and also all time on Tuesdays and Wednesdays usually allowed for private members' bills, were to be occupied with consideration of Government measures. Hardly a Liberal voice was raised against this arbitrary ruling. The Irish members indeed were delighted with it, since it gave the Home Rule Bill an advantage. The Labour members seemed complacent, and the rest of the coalition were indifferent. One back-bench Liberal went so far as to rise and thank the Prime Minister for the courtesy with which the gagging process was accomplished. There was some show of fight made by the opposition, but Conservative indignation was tempered by the reflection that the precedent established might be followed to advantage when their party came into power. Sir George Kemp then announced that he would take May the 5th for the second reading of the Conciliation Bill, and the supporters of the bill, according to their various convictions, set to work to further its interests. The conviction of the W.S.P.U. was that Mr. Asquith's Government would never allow the bill to pass until they were actually forced to do so, and we adopted our own methods to secure a definite pledge from the Government that they would give facilities to the bill. In April of that year the census was to be taken, and we organized a census resistance on the part of women. According to our law, the census of the entire kingdom must be taken every 10 years on a designated day. Our plan was to reduce the value of the census for statistical purposes by refusing to make the required returns. Two ways of resistance presented themselves. The first and most important was direct resistance by occupiers who should refuse to fill in the census papers. This laid the register open to a fine of £5 or a month's imprisonment, and thus required the exercise of considerable courage. The second means of resistance was evasion, staying away from home during the entire time that the enumerators were taking the census. We made the announcement of this plan, and instantly there ensued a splendid response from women and a chorus of horrified disapproval from the Conservative public. The Times voiced this disapproval in a leading article, to which I replied, giving our reasons for the protest. "The census," I wrote, "is a numbering of the people. Until women count as people for the purpose of representation in the councils of the nation as well as for the purposes of taxation, we shall refuse to be numbered." On the subject of laws made by men, without the assistance of women, for the protection of women and children, I have a very special feeling. From my experience as a poor law guardian and as registrar of births and deaths, I know how ridiculously, say rather how tragically, these laws fall short of protection. Take, for instance, the vaunted Children's Charter of 1906, the measure which spread Mr. Lloyd George's fame throughout the world. A volume could be filled with the mistakes and the cruelties of that Act, the object of which is the preservation and improvement of child life. A distinguishing characteristic of the Act is that it puts most of the responsibility for the neglect of children on the backs of the mothers, who, under the laws of England, have no rights as parents. 2 or 3 especially striking cases of this kind came into notice about this time and gave the census resistance an additional justification. The case of Annie Wilmore was a very pitiful one. She was arrested and sentenced to Holloway for 6 weeks for neglecting her children. The evidence showed that the woman lived with her husband and children in a miserable hovel, which would have been almost impossible to keep clean even if there had been water in the house. As it was, the poor soul, who was in ill health and weakened by deprivation, had to carry all the water she used across a great distance. The children as well as the house were very dirty, it was true, but the children were well nourished and kindly treated. The husband, a labourer, out of work much of the time, testified that his wife starved herself to feed the kids. Yet she had violated the terms of the Children's Charter, and she went to prison. I am glad to say that owing to the efforts of suffragists she was pardoned and provided with a better home. Another case was that of Helen Conroy, who was charged with living in one wretched room, with her husband and 7 children, the youngest a month old. According to the law, the mother was forbidden to have this infant in bed with her overnight, yet part of the charge against her was that the child was found sleeping in a box of damp straw. Doubtless she would have preferred a cradle, or even a box of dry straw, but direst poverty made the cradle impossible, and the conditions of the tenement kept the straw damp. Both parents in this instance were sent to prison for 3 months at hard labour. The magistrate casually remarked that the house in which these poor people lived had been condemned 2 years before, but some respectable property owner was still collecting rents from it. Another poor mother, evicted from her home because she could not pay the rent, took her 4 children out into the open country, and when found was sleeping with them in a gravel pit. She was sent to prison for a month, and the children went to the workhouse. These sorry mothers, logical results of the subjection of women, are enough in themselves to justify almost any defiance of a government who denied the women the right to work out their destinies in freedom. No pledge having been secured from the Prime Minister by April 1st, we carried out, and most successfully, our census resistance. Many thousands of women all over the country refused or evaded the returns. I returned my census paper with the words "No vote, no census" written across it, and other women followed that example with similar messages. One woman filled in the blank with full information about her one manservant, and added that there were many women but no more persons in her household. In Birmingham, 16 women of wealth packed their houses with women resisters. They slept on the floors, on chairs and tables, and even in the baths. The head of a large college threw open the building to 300 women. Many women in other cities held all-night parties for friends who wished to remain away from home. In some places, unoccupied houses were rented for the night by resisters who lay on the bare boards. Some groups of women hired gypsy vans and spent the night on the moors. In London we gave a great concert at Queen's Hall on census night. Many of us walked about Trafalgar Square until midnight, and then repaired to Aldwych skating rink, where we amused ourselves until morning. Some skated while others looked on, and enjoyed the admirable music and theatrical entertainment that helped to pass the hours. We had with us a number of the brightest stars in the theatrical world, and they were generous in their contributions. It being Sunday night, the chairman had to call on each of the artists for a speech instead of a song or other turn. An all-night restaurant near at hand did a big business, and on the whole the resisters had a very good time. The Scala Theatre was the scene of another all-night entertainment. There was a good deal of curiosity to see what the government would devise in the way of a punishment for the rebellious women, but the government realized the impossibility of taking punitive action, and Mr. John Burns, who, as head of the local government board, was responsible for the census, announced that they had decided to treat the affair with magnanimity. The number of evasions, he declared, were insignificant, but everyone knew that this was the exact reverse of the facts. The Conciliation Bill was debated on May 5th and passed its second reading by the enormous majority of 137. And now the public and a section of the press united in a strong demand that the government yield to the undoubted will of the House and grant facilities to the bill. The Conciliation Committee sent a deputation of members to the Prime Minister to remind him of his pre-election promise that the House of Commons should have an opportunity of dealing with the whole question of woman suffrage, but they succeeded only in getting his assurance that he had the matter under consideration. Late in the month the announcement was made in the House that the government would not grant facilities during that session, but, since the new bill fulfilled the conditions named by the Prime Minister and was now capable of amendment, the government recognized it to be their duty to grant facilities in some session of the present Parliament. They would be prepared next session, when the bill had been read for the second time, either as a result of obtaining a good place in the ballot, or, if that did not happen, by a grant of a government day for the purpose, to give a week, which they understood to be the time suggested as reasonable by the promoters for its further stages. This pledge was made in order to deter the W.S.P.U. from making militant demonstration in connection with the coronation of the King. Keir Hardie asked if the government would, by means of closure or otherwise, make certain that the bill would go through in the week, and the Prime Minister replied, "No, I cannot give an assurance of that kind. After all, it is a problem of the very greatest magnitude." This reply seemed to make the government's pledge practically worthless. The Conciliation Committee also realized the possibilities of the bill being talked out, and Lord Lytton wrote to Mr. Asquith and asked him for assurances that the facilities offered were intended not for academic discussion, but for effective opportunity for carrying the bill. He also asked that the week offered should not be construed rigidly, but that, providing the committee stage were got through in the time, additional days for the report and third reading stages might be forthcoming. Reasonable opportunity for making use of the closure was also asked. To Lord Lytton's letter the Prime Minister replied as follows: "My dear Lytton, in reply to your letter on the subject of the Women's Enfranchisement Bill, I would refer you to some observations recently made in a speech at the National Liberal Club by Sir Edward Grey, which accurately expresses the intention of the Government. It follows to answer your specific inquiries, that the week offered will be interpreted with reasonable elasticity, that the Government will interpose no reasonable obstacle to the proper use of the closure, and that if, as you suggest, the bill gets through the committee in the time proposed, the extra days required for report and third reading will not be refused. The Government, though divided in opinion on the merits of the bill, are unanimous in their determination to give effect, not only in the letter but in the spirit, to the promise in regards to the facilities which I made on their behalf before the last general election. Yours, etc., H. H. Asquith. Skeptical up to this point, the W.S.P.U. was now convinced that the Government were sincere in their promise to give the bill full facilities in the following year. We held a joyful mass meeting in Queen's Hall, and I again declared that the warfare against the Government was at an end. Our new policy was the inauguration of a great holiday campaign, with the object of making victory in 1912 absolutely certain. Electors must be aroused, members of Parliament held to their allegiance. Women must be organised in order that questions that vitally affect the social welfare of the country might be placed before them. I chose Scotland and Wales as the scenes of my holiday labours. I may say that our confidence was fully shared by the public at large. The belief in Mr. Asquith's pledge was accurately reflected in a leader published in The Nation, which said, "From the moment the Prime Minister signed the frank and ungrudging letter to Lord Lytton, which appeared in last Saturday's newspapers, women became, in all but the legal formality, voters and citizens. For at least 2 years, if not for longer, nothing has been lacking save a full and fair opportunity for the House of Commons to translate its convictions into the precise language of a statute. That opportunity has been promised for next session, and promised in terms and under conditions which ensure success." The only thing, as we thought, that we had to fear were wrecking amendments to the bill, and in the new by-election policy which we adopted, we worked against all candidates of every party who would refuse to promise, not only to support the Conciliation Committee to carry the bill, but also to vote against any amendment the committee thought dangerous. We believed that we had covered every possibility of disaster, but we had something yet to learn of the treachery of the Asquith Ministry and their capacity for cold-blooded lying. Mr. Lloyd George from the first was an open enemy of the bill, but since we had no doubt of the sincerity of the Prime Minister, we could only conclude that Mr. Lloyd George had detached himself from the main body of the Government, and had become the self-constituted leader of the opposition. In an address to a large Liberal group, Mr. Lloyd George advised that Liberal members be asked to ballot for a place for a democratic measure, in order that such a measure might claim the Prime Minister's pledge for the facilities next session. In one or two other speeches he made vague allusions to the possibilities of introducing another suffrage bill. His own idea was to amend the bill to give a vote to wives of all electors, making married women voters in virtue of their husband's qualification. The inevitable effect of such an amendment would be to wreck the bill, since it would have enfranchised about 6,000,000 women in addition to the 1,500,000 who would benefit by the original terms of the bill. Such a wholesale addition to the electorate was never known in England, the number enfranchised by the Reform Bill of 1832 being hardly more than 500,000. The Reform Bill of 1867 admitted 1,000,000 new voters, and that of 1884 perhaps 2 millions. The absurdity of Mr. Lloyd George's proposal was such that we did not regard it seriously. We did not allow his opposition to give us serious alarm until a day in August when a Welsh member, Mr. Leif Jones, asked the Prime Minister from the floor of the House whether he was aware that his promise for facilities for the Conciliation Bill in the next session was being claimed exclusively for that bill, and asked further for a statement that the promised facilities would be equally granted to any other suffrage bill that might secure a second reading and was capable of amendment. Mr. Lloyd George, speaking for the Government, replied that they could not undertake to give facilities to more than one bill on the same subject, but that any bill which, satisfying these tests, secured a second reading would be treated by them as falling within their engagements. Astounded at this plain evasion of a sacred promise, Lord Lytton again wrote to the Prime Minister, reviewing the entire matter, and asking for another statement of the Government's intentions. The following is the text of Mr. Asquith's reply. My dear Lytton, I have no hesitation in saying that the promises made by and on behalf of the Government in regard to giving facilities to the Conciliation Bill will be strictly adhered to, both in letter and in spirit. Yours sincerely, H. H. Asquith, August 23rd, 1911. Again we were reassured, and our confidence in the Premier's pledge remained unshaken throughout the campaign, although Mr. Lloyd George continued to throw out hints that the promises of facilities for the bill were altogether illusory. We could not believe him, and when, 2 months later, I was asked in America, when will English women vote, I replied with perfect conviction, next year. This was in Louisville, Kentucky, where I attended the 1911 annual convention of the National American Women Suffrage Association. I remember this third visit to the United States with especial pleasure. I was the guest in New York of Dr. and Mrs. John Winters Brannan, and through the courtesy of Dr. Brannan, who is at the head of all the city hospitals, I saw something of the penal system and the institutional life of America. We visited the workhouses and the penitentiary on Blackwell's Island, and although I am told that these places are not regarded as model institutions, I can assure my readers that they are infinitely superior to the English prisons where women are punished for trying to win their political freedom. In the American prisons, much as they lacked in some essentials, I saw no solitary confinement, no rule of silence, no deadly air of officialdom. The food was good and varied, and above all, there was an air of kindness and good feeling between the officials and the prisoners that is almost wholly lacking in England. But after all, in the United States, as in other countries, the problem of the relations between the unfranchised women and the state remains unsolved and unsatisfactory. One night my friends took me to that sombre and terrible institution, the Night Court for Women. We sat on the bench with the magistrate, and he very courteously explained everything to us. The whole business was heartbreaking. All the women, with one exception, an old drunkard, were charged with solicitation. Most of them were of high type by nature. It all seemed so hopeless, and it was clear that they were victims of an evil system. Their conviction was a foregone conclusion. The magistrate said that in most cases the reason for their coming here was economic. One case of a little cigar maker, who said very simply that she only went on the streets when out of work, and that when in work she earned $8 a week, was very tragic and touching. I could not keep the Night Court out of my speeches after that. The whole dreadful injustice of women's lives seemed mirrored in that place. I went as far as the Pacific Coast on this visit, spending Christmas Day in Seattle, and for the first time seeing a community where women and men existed on terms of exact equality. It was a delightful experience. As I wrote home to our members, the men of the Western States seemed to my eyes eager, earnest, rough men, building a great community in a great hurry, but never have I seen greater respect, courtesy, and chivalry shown to women than in that one suffrage state it has been my privilege to visit. I am getting a little ahead of my story, however. It was in November, when I was in the city of Minneapolis, that a crushing blow descended on the English suffragettes. I learned of this through cabled despatches in the newspapers and from private cables, and was so staggered that I could scarcely command myself sufficiently to fill my immediate engagements. This was the news that the government had broken their plighted word and had deliberately destroyed the Conciliation Bill. My first wild thought, on hearing of this act of treachery, was to cancel all engagements and return to England, but my final decision to remain afterwards proved the right one, because the women at home, without a moment's loss of time, struck the answering blow, guided by that insight which has been characteristic of every act of the members of our Union. I did not return to England until January 11, 1912, and by that time great deeds had been done. Our movement had entered upon a new and more vigorous stage of militancy. End of Book 2, Chapter 8. End of Book 2. Book 3, Chapter 1 of My Own Story by Emmeline Pankhurst. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. The Women's Revolution, Chapter 1. Parliament had reassembled on October 25, 1911, and the first move on the part of the government was, to say the least of it, rather unpropitious. The Prime Minister submitted two motions, the first one empowering them to take all the time of the House during the remainder of the session, and the second guillotining discussion on the Insurance Bill, so as to force the measure through before Christmas. One day only was allotted to the clauses relating to women in that bill. These clauses were notoriously unfair. They provided for sickness insurance of about 4,000,000 women and unemployment insurance of no women at all. Under the provision of the bill, 11,000,000 men were insured against sickness and about 2,500,000 against unemployment. Women were given lower benefits for the same premium as men, and premiums paid out of the family income were credited solely to the men's account. The bill as drafted provided no form of insurance for wives, mothers, and daughters who spent their lives at home working for the family. It penalized women for staying in the home, which most men agree is women's only legitimate sphere of action. The amended bill grudgingly allowed, aside from maternity benefits, a small insurance, on rather difficult terms, for working women's wives. Thus the re-elected government's first utterance to women was one of contempt, and this was followed, on November 7th, by the almost incredible announcement that the government intended, at the next session, to introduce a manhood suffrage bill. This announcement was not made in the House of Commons, but to a deputation of men from the People's Suffrage Federation, a small group of people who advocated universal adult suffrage. The deputation, which was very privately arranged for, was received by Mr. Asquith, and then the Minister of Elibank, Chief Liberal Whip. The spokesman asked Mr. Asquith to bring in a government measure for universal adult suffrage, including adult women. The Prime Minister replied that the Government had pledged facilities for the Conciliation Bill, which was as far as they were prepared to go in the matter of women's suffrage. But, he added, the Government intended in the next session to introduce and to pass through all its stages a genuine Reform Bill which would sweep away existing qualifications for the franchise and substitute a single qualification of residence. The bill would apply to adult males only, but it would be so framed as to be open to a women's suffrage amendment in case the House of Commons desired to make that extension and amendment. This portentous announcement came like a bolt from the blue, and there was strong condemnation of the Government's treachery to women. Said the Saturday Review, with absolutely no demand, no ghost of a demand, for more votes for men, and with, beyond all cavil, a very strong demand for votes for women, the Government announced their manhood suffrage bill and carefully evade the other question. For a naked, avowed plan of gerrymandering, no Government surely ever did beat this one. The Daily Mail said that the policy which Mr. Asquith proposes is absolutely indefensible. And the Evening Standard and Globe said, we are no friends of female suffrage, but anything more contemptible than the attitude assumed by the Government it is difficult to imagine. If the Government hoped to deceive anyone by their dishonest reference to the possibility of a woman suffrage amendment, they were disappointed. Said the Evening News, Mr. Asquith's bombshell will blow the Conciliation Bill to smithereens, for it is impossible to have a manhood suffrage for men and a property qualification for women. True, the Premier consents to leave the question of women's suffrage to the House, but he knows well enough what the decision of the House will be. The Conciliation Bill had a chance, but the larger measure has none at all. I have quoted these newspaper leaders to show you that our opinion of the Government's action was shared even by the press. Universal suffrage in a country where women are in a majority of 1,000,000 is not likely to happen in the lifetime of any reader of this volume, and the Government's generous offer of a possible amendment was nothing more than a gratuitous insult to the suffragists. The truce naturally came to an abrupt end. The W.S.P.U. wrote to the Prime Minister saying that consternation had been aroused by the Government's announcement, and that it had been decided accordingly to send a deputation representing the Women's Social and Political Union to wait upon himself and the Chancellor of the Exchequer on the evening of November 21st. The purpose of the deputation was to demand that the proposed manhood suffrage bill be abandoned, and that in its place should be introduced a Government measure giving equal franchise rights to men and women. A similar letter was dispatched to Mr. Lloyd George. 6 times before on occasions of crisis had the W.S.P.U. requested an interview with Mr. Asquith, and each time they had been refused. This time the Prime Minister replied that he had decided to receive a deputation of the various suffrage societies on November 17th, including your own society if you desire it. It was proposed that each society appoint 4 representatives as members of the deputation which would be received by the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer. 9 suffrage societies sent representatives to the meeting, our own representatives being Emmeline Pankhurst, Mrs. Pethick Lawrence, Miss Annie Kenny, Lady Constance Lytton, and Miss Elizabeth Robbins. Christabel and Mrs. Lawrence spoke for the Union, and they did not hesitate to accuse the 2 ministers to their faces of having grossly tricked and falsely misled women. Mr. Asquith, in his reply to the deputation, resented these imputations. He had kept his pledge, he insisted, in regard to the Conciliation Bill. He was perfectly willing to give facilities to the bill if the women preferred that to an amendment to his Reform Bill. Moreover, he denied that he had made any new announcement. As far back as 1908 he had distinctly declared that the Government regarded it as a sacred duty to bring forward a manhood suffrage bill before that Parliament came to an end. It was true that the Government did not carry out that binding obligation, and it was also true that until the present time nothing more was ever said about a manhood suffrage bill, but that was not the Government's fault. The crisis of the Lord's veto had momentarily displaced the bill. Now he merely proposed to fulfil his promise made in 1908, and also his promise about giving facilities to the Conciliation Bill. He was ready to keep both promises. While he knew that those promises were incompatible, that the fulfilment of both was therefore impossible, and Christabel told him so bluntly and fearlessly. "We are not satisfied," she warned him, and the Prime Minister said acidly, "I did not expect to satisfy you." The reply of the W.S.P.U. was immediate and forceful. Led by Mrs. Pethick Lawrence, our women went out with stones and hammers and broke hundreds of windows in the Home Office, the War and Foreign Offices, the Board of Education, the Privy Council Office, the Board of Trade, the Treasury, Somerset House, the National Liberal Club, several post offices, the Old Banqueting Hall, the London and South Western Bank, and a dozen other buildings, including the residence of Lord Haldane and Mr. John Burns. 220 women were arrested and about 150 of them sent to prison for terms varying from a week to 2 months. One individual protest deserves mention because of its prophetic character. In December, Miss Emily Wilding Davison was arrested for attempting to set fire to a letter box at Parliament Street Post Office. In court, Miss Davison said she did it as a protest against the government's treachery and as a demand that women's suffrage be included in the King's speech. The protest was meant to be serious, she said, and so I adopted a serious course. In past agitation for reform, the next step after window breaking was incendiarism, in order to draw the attention of the private citizens to the fact that this question of reform was their concern as well as that of women. Miss Davison received the severe sentence of 6 months' imprisonment for her deed. To this state of affairs I returned from my American tour. I had the comfort of reflecting that my imprisoned comrades were being accorded better treatment than the earlier prisoners had known. Since early in 1910 some concessions had been granted, and some acknowledgment of the political character of our offences had been made. During the brief period when these scant concessions to justice were allowed, the hunger strike was abandoned and prison was robbed of its worst horror, forcible feeding. The situation was bad enough, however, and I could see that it might easily become a great deal worse. We had reached a stage at which the mere sympathy of members of Parliament, however sincerely felt, was no longer of the slightest use. Reminding our members this, in the first speeches made after returning to England, I asked them to prepare themselves for more action. If women's suffrage was not included in the next King's speech, we should have to make it absolutely impossible for the government to touch the question of the franchise. The King's speech, when Parliament met in February 1912, alluded to the franchise question in very general terms. Proposals, it was stated, would be brought forward for the amendment of the law with respect to the franchise and the registration of electors. This might be construed to mean that the government were going to introduce a manhood suffrage bill or a bill for the abolition of plural voting, which had been suggested in some quarters as a substitute for the manhood suffrage bill. No precise statement of the government's intentions was made, and the whole franchise question was left in a cloud of uncertainty. Mr. Ag Gardner, a Unionist member of the Conciliation Committee, drew the third place in the ballot, and he announced that he should reintroduce the Conciliation Bill. This interested us very slightly, for knowing its prospect of success to have been destroyed, for we were done with the Conciliation Bill forever. Nothing less than a government measure would henceforth satisfy the WSPU, because it had been clearly demonstrated that only a government measure would be allowed to pass the House of Commons. With sublime faith, or rather with a deplorable lack of political insight, the Women's Liberal Federation and the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies professed full confidence in the proposed amendment to a manhood suffrage bill, but we knew how futile was that hope. We saw that the only course to take was to offer determined opposition to any measure of suffrage that did not include as an integral part equal suffrage for men and women. On February 16th we held a large meeting of welcome to a number of released prisoners who had served 2 and 3 months for the window-breaking demonstration that had taken place in the previous November. At this meeting we candidly surveyed the situation and agreed on a course of action which we believed would be sufficiently strong to prevent the government from advancing their threatened franchise bill. I said on this occasion, "We don't want to use any weapons that are unnecessarily strong. If the argument of the stone, that time-honoured official political argument, is sufficient, then we will never use any stronger argument. And that is the weapon and the argument that we are going to use next time. And so I say to every volunteer on our demonstration, be prepared to use that argument. I am taking charge of the demonstration, and that is the argument I am going to use. I am not going to use it for any sentimental reason. I am going to use it because it is the easiest and most readily understood. Why should women go to Parliament Square and be battered about and insulted, and most important of all, produce less effect than when we throw stones? We tried it long enough. We submitted 4 years patiently to insult and assault. Women had their health injured. Women lost their lives. We should not have minded if that had succeeded, but that did not succeed, and we have made more progress with less hurt to ourselves by breaking glass than ever we made when we allowed them to break our bodies. After all, is not a woman's life, is not her health, are not her limbs more valuable than panes of glass? There is no doubt of that, but most important of all, does not the breaking of glass produce more effect upon the government? If you are fighting a battle, that should dictate your choice of weapons. Well then, we are going to try this time if mere stones will do it. I do not think it will ever be necessary for us to arm ourselves as Chinese women have done, but there are women who are prepared to do that if it should be necessary. In this union we don't lose our heads. We only go as far as we are obliged to go in order to win, and we are going forward with this next protest demonstration in full faith that this plan of campaign initiated by our friends whom we honor tonight, will on this next occasion prove effective. Ever since militancy took on the form of destruction of property, the public generally, both at home and abroad, has expressed curiosity as to the logical connection between acts such as breaking windows, firing pillar boxes, etc., and the vote. Only a complete lack of historical knowledge excuses that curiosity. For every advance of men's political freedom has been marked with violence and the destruction of property. Usually the advance has been marked by war, which is called glorious. Sometimes it has been marked by rioting, which are deemed less glorious, but are at least effective. That speech of mine, just quoted, will probably strike the reader as one inciting to violence and illegal action, things as a rule in ordinary circumstances quite inexcusable. Well, I will call the reader's attention to what was, in this connection, a rather singular coincidence. At the very hour when I was making that speech, advising my audience of the political necessity of physical revolt, a responsible member of the government, in another hall, in another city, was telling his audience precisely the same thing. This Cabinet member, the Right Honourable C.E.H. Hobhouse, addressing a large anti-suffrage meeting in his constituency of Bristol, said that the suffrage movement was not a political issue because its adherents had failed to prove that behind this movement existed a large public demand. He declared that in the case of the suffrage demand there has not been the kind of popular sentimental uprising which accounted for Nottingham Castle in 1832 or the Hyde Park railings in 1867. There has not been a great ebullition of popular feeling. The popular sentimental uprising to which Mr. Hobhouse alluded was the burning to the ground of the castle of the anti-suffrage Duke of Newcastle and of Colwick Castle, the county seat of another of the leaders of the opposition against the Franchise Bill. The militant men of that time did not select uninhabited buildings to be fired. They burned both these historic residences over their owners' heads. Indeed, the wife of the owner of Colwick Castle died as a result of shock and exposure on that occasion. No arrests were made, no men imprisoned. On the contrary, the King sent for the Premier and begged the Whig ministers favourable to the Franchise Bill not to resign, and intimated that this was also the wish of the Lords who had thrown out the bill. Molesworth's History of England says, "These declarations were imperatively called for. The danger was imminent, and the ministers knew it, and did all that lay in their power to tranquillize the people, and to assure them that the bill was only delayed and not finally defeated." For a time the people believed this, but soon they lost patience, and seeing signs of a renewed activity on the part of the anti-suffragists, they became aggressive again. Bristol, the very city in which Mr. Hobhouse made his speech, was set on fire. The militant reformers burned the new jail, the toll houses, the Bishop's Palace, both sides of Queen Square, including the Mansion House, the Custom House, the Excise Office, many warehouses, and other private property, the whole valued at over £100,000, $500,000. It was as a result of such violence, and in fear of more violence, that the Reform Bill was hurried through Parliament and became law in June 1832. Our demonstration, so mild by comparison with English men's political agitation, was announced for March 4th, and the announcement created much public alarm. Sir William Byles gave notice that he would ask the Secretary of State for the Home Department whether his attention had been drawn to a speech by Mrs. Pankhurst last Friday night, openly and emphatically inciting her hearers to violent outrage and the destruction of property, and threatening the use of firearms if stones did not prove sufficiently effective, and what steps he proposes to take to protect society from this outbreak of lawlessness. The question was duly asked, and the Home Secretary replied that his attention had been called to the speech, but that it would not be desirable in the public interest to say more than this at present. Whatever preparations the police department were making to prevent the demonstration, they failed because, while as usual we were able to calculate exactly what the police department were going to do, they were utterly unable to calculate what we were going to do. We had planned a demonstration for March the 4th, and this one we announced. We planned another demonstration for March 1st, but this one we did not announce. Late in the afternoon of Friday, March 1st, I drove in a taxicab, accompanied by the Honourable Secretary of the Union, Mrs. Tuke, and another one of our members, to No. 10 Downing Street, the official residence of the Prime Minister. It was exactly 5:30 when we alighted from the cab and threw our stones, 4 of them, through the window panes. As we expected, we were promptly arrested and then taken to Cannon Row Police Station. The hour that followed will long be remembered in London. At intervals of 15 minutes, relays of women who had volunteered for the demonstration did their work. The first smashing of glass occurred in the Haymarket and Piccadilly, and greatly startled and alarmed both pedestrians and police. A large number of the women were arrested, and everybody thought that this ended the affair. But before the excited populace and the frustrated shop owners' first exclamation had died down, before the police had reached the station with their prisoners, the ominous crashing and splintering of plate glass began again, this time along both sides of Regent Street and the Strand. A furious rush of police and people toward the second scene of action ensued. While their attention was being taken up with occurrences in this quarter, the third relay of women began breaking windows in the Oxford Circus and Bond Street. This demonstration ended for the day at 6:30 with the breaking of many windows in the Strand. The Daily Mail gave this graphic account of the demonstration. From every part of the crowded and brilliantly lighted streets came the crash of splintered glass. People started, as a window shattered at their side. Suddenly there was another crash in front of them, on the other side of the street, behind, everywhere. Scared shop assistants came running out to the pavements. Traffic stopped. Policemen sprang this way and that. 5 minutes later the streets were a procession of excited groups, each surrounding a woman wrecker being led in custody to the nearest police station. Meanwhile the shopping quarter of London had plunged itself into a sudden twilight. Shutters were hurriedly fitted. The rattle of iron curtains being drawn came from every side. Guards of commissionaires and shopmen were quickly mounted, and any unaccompanied lady in sight, especially if she carried a handbag, became an object of menacing suspicion. At the hour when this demonstration was being made, a conference was being held at Scotland Yard to determine what should be done to prevent the smashing of windows on the coming Monday night. But we had not announced the hour of our March 4th protest. I had in my speech simply invited women to assemble in Parliament Square on the evening of March 4th, and they accepted the invitation. Said the Daily Telegraph. By 6 o'clock the neighbourhood Houses of Parliament were in a stage of siege. Shopkeepers in almost every instance barricaded their premises, removed goods from the windows and prepared for the worst. A few minutes before 6 o'clock a huge force of police, amounting to nearly 3,000 constables, was posted in Parliament Square. Whitehall and streets adjoining and large reserves were gathered in Westminster Hall and Scotland Yard. By 8:30 Whitehall was packed from end to end with police and public. Mounted constables rode up and down Whitehall, keeping the people on the move. At no time was there any sign of danger. The demonstration had taken place in the morning, when 100 or more women walked quietly into Knightsbridge and walking singly along the streets demolished nearly every pane of glass they passed. Taken by surprise, the police arrested as many as they could reach, but most of the women escaped. For that 2 days' work, something like 200 suffragettes were taken to the various police stations, and for days the long procession of women streamed through the courts. The dismayed magistrates found themselves facing, not only former rebels, but many new ones. In some cases women whose names, like that of Dr. Ethel Smith, the composer, were famous throughout Europe. These women, when arraigned, made clear and lucid statements of their positions and their motives, but magistrates are not schooled to examine motives. They are trained to think only of laws, and mostly of laws protecting property. Their ears are not tuned to listen to words like those spoken by one of the prisoners who said, "We have tried every means, processions and meetings, which were of no avail. We have tried demonstrations, and now at last we have to break windows. I wish I had broken more. I am not in the least repentant. Our women are working in far worse condition than the striking miners. I have seen widows struggling to bring up their children. Only 2 out of every 5 are fit to be soldiers. What is the good of a country like ours? England is absolutely on the wane. You have only one point of view, and that is the men's, and while men have done the best they could, they cannot go far without the women and the women's views. We believe the whole is in a muddle too horrible to think of." The coal miners were at that time engaging in a terrible strike, and the government, instead of arresting the leaders, were trying to come to terms of peace with them. I reminded the magistrate of this fact, and I told him that what the women had done was but a flea bite by comparison with the miners' violence. I said further, "I hope our demonstration will be enough to show the government that the women's agitation is going on. If not, if you send me to prison, I will go further to show that women who have to help pay the salaries of cabinet ministers, and your salary too, sir, are going to have some voice in the making of the laws they have to obey." I was sentenced to 2 months' imprisonment. Others received sentences ranging from 1 week to 2 months, while those who were accused of breaking glass above £5 in value were committed for trial in higher courts. They were sent to prison on remand, when the last of us were behind grim gates, not only Holloway, but 3 other women's prisons were taxed to provide for so many extra inmates. It was a stormy imprisonment for most of us. A great many of the women had received, in addition to their sentences, hard labour, and this meant that the privileges at that time accorded to suffragettes as political offenders were withheld. The women adopted the hunger strike as a protest, but as the hint was conveyed to me that the privileges would be restored, I advised a cessation of the strike. The remand prisoners demanded that I be allowed to exercise with them, and when this was not answered they broke the windows of their cells. The other suffrage prisoners, hearing the sound of shattered glass and the singing of the Marseillaise, immediately broke their windows. The time had long gone by when the suffragettes submitted meekly to prison discipline. And so passed the first days of my imprisonment. End of Book 3, Chapter 1. Book 3, Chapter 2 of my own story by Emmeline Pankhurst. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. The Women's Revolution, Chapter 2. The panic-stricken government did not rest content with the imprisonment of the window breakers. They sought, in a blind and blundering fashion, to perform the impossible feat of wrecking at a blow the entire militant movement. Governments have always tried to crush reform movements, to destroy ideas, to kill the thing that cannot die. Without regard to history, which shows that no government have ever succeeded in doing this, they go on trying in the old, senseless way. For days before the two demonstrations described in the last chapter, our headquarters in Clement's Inn had been under constant observation by the police, and on the evening of March 5th an inspector of police and a large force of detectives suddenly descended on the place, with warrants for the arrest of Christabel Pankhurst and Mr. and Mrs. Pethick Lawrence, who, with Mrs. Tuke and myself, were charged with conspiring to incite certain persons to commit malicious damage to property. When the officers entered they found Mr. Pethick Lawrence at work in his office and Mrs. Pethick Lawrence in her flat upstairs. My daughter was not in the building. The Lawrences, after making brief preparations, drove in a taxicab to the Bow Street station, where they spent the night. The police remained in possession of the offices, and detectives were dispatched to find and arrest Christabel. But that arrest never took place. Christabel Pankhurst eluded the entire force of detectives and uniformed police, trained hunters of human prey. Christabel had gone home, and at first, on hearing of the arrest of Mr. and Mrs. Pethick Lawrence, had taken her own arrest for granted. A little reflection, however, showed her the danger in which the Union would stand if completely deprived of its accustomed leadership, and seeing that it was her duty to avoid arrest, she quietly left the house. She spent that night with friends who, next morning, helped her to make the necessary arrangements and saw her safely away from London. That same night she reached Paris, where she has since remained. My relief, when I learned of her flight, was very great, because I knew that whatever happened to the Lawrences and myself, the movement would be wisely directed, this in spite of the fact that the police remained in full possession of headquarters. The offices in Clement's Inn were thoroughly ransacked by the police, in a determined effort to secure evidence of conspiracy. They went through every desk, file, and cabinet, taking away with them 2 cab loads of books and papers, including all my private papers, photographs of my children in infancy, and letters sent me by my husband long ago. Some of these I never saw again. The police also terrorized the printer of our weekly newspaper, and although the paper came out as usual, about a third of its columns were left blank. The headlines, however, with the ensuing space mere white paper, produced a most dramatic effect. History Teaches read one headline to a blank space, plainly indicating that the government were not willing to let the public know some of the things that History teaches. Women's Moderation suggested that the destroyed paragraph called for comparison of the women's window breaking with men's greater violence in the past. Most eloquent of all was the editorial page, absolutely blank except for the headline, A Challenge, and the name at the foot of the last column, Christabel Pankhurst. What words could have breathed a profounder defiance, a more implacable resolve? Christabel was gone, out of the clutches of the government, yet she remained in complete possession of the field. For weeks the search for her went relentlessly on. Police searched every railway station, every train, every seaport. The police of every city in the kingdom were furnished with her portrait. Every amateur Sherlock Holmes in England joined with the police in finding her. She was reported in a dozen cities, including New York. But all the time she was living quietly in Paris, in daily communication with the workers in London, who within a few days were once more at their appointed tasks. My daughter has remained in France ever since. Meanwhile, I found myself in the anomalous position of a convicted offender serving 2 months' prison sentence, and of a prisoner on remand waiting to be charged with a more serious offence. I was in very bad health, having been placed in a damp and unwarmed 3rd Division cell, the result being an acute attack of bronchitis. I addressed a letter to the Home Secretary, telling him of my condition, and urging the necessity of liberty to recover my health and to prepare my case for trial. I asked for release on bail, the plain right of a remand prisoner, and I offered, if bail were granted now, to serve the rest of my 2 months' sentence later on. The sole concessions granted to me, however, were removal to a better cell, and the right to see my secretary and my solicitor, but only in the presence of a wardress and a member of the prison clerical staff. On March 14th, Mr. and Mrs. Pethick Lawrence, Mrs. Tuke, and myself were brought up for preliminary hearing on the charge of having, on November 1st, 1911, and on various other dates, conspired and combined together unlawfully and maliciously to commit damage, etc. The case opened on March 14th in a crowded courtroom in which I saw many friends. Mr. Bodkin, who appeared for the prosecution, made a very long address, in which he endeavoured to prove that the Women's Social and Political Union was a highly developed organization of most sinister character. He produced much documentary evidence, some of it of such amusing character that the court rocked with stifled laughter, and the judge was obliged to conceal his smiles behind his hand. Mr. Bodkin cited our code book, with the assistance of which we were able to communicate private messages. His voice sank to a scandalized half-whisper as he stated the fact that we had presumed to include the sacred persons of the government in our private code. "We find," said Mr. Bodkin portentously, "that public men in the service of His Majesty as members of the Cabinet are tabulated here under code names. We find that the Cabinet collectively has its code word, trees, and individual members of the Cabinet are designated by the name, sometimes of trees, but I am also bound to say the commonest weeds as well." Here a ripple of laughter interrupted. Mr. Bodkin frowned heavily and continued. "There is one," he said solemnly, "called pansy, another one, more complimentary, rose, another, violets, and so on." Each of the defendants was designated by a code letter. Thus Mrs. Pankhurst was identified by the letter F, Mrs. Pethick Lawrence D, Miss Christabel Pankhurst E. Every public building, including the House of Commons, had its code name. The deadly possibilities of the code were illustrated by a telegram found in one of the files. It read, "Silk thistle pansy, duck wool EQ." Translated by the aid of the code book, the telegram read, "Will you protest Asquith's public meeting tomorrow evening, but don't get arrested unless success depends on it. Wire back to Christabel Pankhurst, Clement's Inn." More laughter followed these revelations, which after all proved no more than the businesslike methods employed by the W.S.P.U. The laughter proved something a great deal more significant, for it was a plain indication that the old respect in which Cabinet Ministers had been held was no more. We had torn the veil from their sacrosanct personalities and shown them for what they were, mean and scheming politicians. More serious from the point of view of prosecution was the evidence brought in by members of the police department in regard to the occurrences of March 1st and 4th. The policeman who arrested me and my two companions in Downing Street on March 1st, after we had broken the windows in the Premier's house, testified that following the arrest we had handed him our reserve stock of stones, and that they were all alike, heavy flints. Our other prisoners were found in possession of similar stones, tending to prove that the stones all came from one source. Other officers testified to the methodical manner in which the window breaking of March 1st and 4th was carried out, how systematically it had been planned, and how soldierly had been the behaviour of the women. By twos and threes March 4th they had been seen to go to the headquarters at Clement's Inn, carrying handbags, which they deposited at headquarters, and had then gone on to a meeting at the Pavilion Music Hall. The police attended the meeting, which was the usual rally preceding a demonstration or a deputation. At 5 o'clock the meeting adjourned, and the women went out as if to go home. The police observed that many of them, still in groups of twos and threes, went to the Gardenia restaurant in Catherine Street, Strand, a place where many suffragette breakfasts and teas had been held. The police thought that about 150 women congregated there on March 4th. They remained until 7 o'clock, and then, under the watching eyes of the police, they sauntered out and dispersed. A few minutes later, when there was no reason to expect such a thing, the noise was heard, in many streets, of wholesale window smashing. The police authorities made much of the fact that the women who had left their bags at headquarters and were afterwards arrested were bailed out that night by Mr. Pethick Lawrence. The similarity of the stones used, the gathering of so many women in one building, prepared for arrest, the waiting at the Gardenia restaurant, the apparent dispersal, the simultaneous destruction in many localities of plate glass, and the bailing of prisoners by a person connected with the headquarters mentioned, certainly showed a carefully worked-out plan. Only a public trial of the defendants could establish whether or not the plan was a conspiracy. On the second day of the ministerial hearing, Mrs. Tuke, who had been in the prison infirmary for 20 days and had to be attended in court by a trained nurse, was admitted to bail. Mr. Pethick Lawrence made a strong plea for bail for himself and his wife, pointing out that they had been in prison on remand for 2 weeks and were entitled to bail. I also demanded the privileges of a prisoner on remand. Both of these pleas were denied by the court, but a few days later the Home Secretary wrote to my solicitor that the remainder of my sentence of 2 months would be remitted until after the conspiracy trial at Bow Street. Mr. and Mrs. Pethick Lawrence had already been admitted to bail. Public opinion forced the Home Secretary to make these concessions, as it is well known that it is next to impossible to prepare a defence while confined in prison. Aside from the terrible effect of prison on one's body and nerves, there is the difficulty of consulting documents and securing other necessary data to be considered. On April 4th, the ministerial hearing ended in the acquittal of Mrs. Tuke, whose activities in the W.S.P.U. were shown to be purely secretarial. Mr. and Mrs. Pethick Lawrence and myself were committed for trial at the next session of the Central Criminal Court, beginning April 23rd. Because of the weak state of my health, the judge was with great difficulty prevailed upon to postpone the trial 2 weeks, and it was, therefore, not until May 15th that the case was open. The trial at Old Bailey is a thing that I shall never forget. The scene is clear before me as I write, the judge impressively bewigged and scarlet-robed, dominating the crowded court-room, the solicitors at their table, the jury, and looking very far away, the anxious pale faces of our friends who crowded the narrow galleries. By the veriest irony of fate, this judge, Lord Coleridge, was the son of Sir Charles Coleridge, who, in the year 1867, appeared with my husband, Dr. Pankhurst, in the famous case of Chorlton v. Lings, and sought to establish that women were persons, and as such were entitled to the parliamentary vote. To make the irony still deeper, the Attorney General, Sir Rufus Isaacs, who appeared as counsel for the prosecution against women militants, himself had been guilty of remarkable speeches in corroboration of our point of view. In a speech made in 1910, in relation to the abolition of the Lord's veto, Sir Rufus made the statement that, although the agitation against privilege was being peacefully conducted, the indignation behind it was very intense. Said Sir Rufus, formerly, when the great mass of the people were voteless, they had to do something violent in order to show what they felt. Today the elector's bullet is his ballot. Let no one be deceived, therefore, because in this present struggle everything is peaceful and orderly, in contrast to the disorderliness of other great struggles of the past. We wondered if the man who said these words could fail to realize that voteless women, deprived of every constitutional means of righting their grievances, were also obliged to do something violent in order to show how they felt. His opening address removed all doubt on that score. Sir Rufus Isaacs has a clear-cut, hawk-like face, deep eyes, and a somewhat world-worn air. The first words he spoke were so astoundingly unfair that I could hardly believe that I heard them aright. He began his address to the jury by telling them that they must not, on any account, connect the act of the defendants with any political agitation. "I am very anxious to impress upon you," he said, "from the moment we begin to deal with the facts of this case, that all questions of whether a woman is entitled to the parliamentary franchise, whether she should have the same right of franchise as a man, are questions which are in no sense involved in the trial of this issue. Therefore I ask you to discard altogether from the consideration of the matters which will be placed before you any viewpoint you may have on this, no doubt, very important political issue." Nevertheless, Sir Rufus added in the course of his remarks that he feared that it would not be possible to keep out of the conduct of the case various references to political events, and of course the entire trial, from beginning to end, showed clearly that the case was what Mr. Tim Healy, Mrs. Pethick Lawrence's counsel, called a great state trial. Proceeding, the Attorney General described the W.S.P.U., which he said he thought had been in existence since 1907, and had used what were known as militant methods. In 1911 the association had become annoyed by the Prime Minister because he would not make women's suffrage what was called a government question. In November 1911 the Prime Minister announced the introduction of a manhood suffrage bill. From that time on the defendants set to work to carry out a campaign which would have meant nothing less than anarchy. Women were to be induced to act together at a given time, in different given places, in such numbers that the police should be paralyzed by the number of persons breaking the law, in order, to use the defendant's own words, to bring the government to its knees. After designating the respective positions held by the 4 defendants in the W.S.P.U., Sir Rufus went on to relate the events which resulted in the smashing of plate-glass windows valued at some £2,000, and the imprisonment of over 200 women who were incited to their deeds by the conspirators in the dock. He entirely ignored the motive of the acts in question, and he treated the whole affair as if the women had been burglars. This inverted statement of the matter, though accurate enough as to facts, was such as might have been given by King John of the signing of Magna Carta. A very great number of witnesses were examined, a large number of them being policemen, and their testimony, in our cross-examination, disclosed the startling fact that there exists in England a special brand of secret police entirely engaged in political work. These men, 75 in number, form what is known as the political branch of the Criminal Investigation Department of the police. They go about in disguise, and their sole duty is to shadow suffragettes and other political workers. They follow certain political workers from their homes to their places of business, to their social pleasures, into tea rooms and restaurants, even to the theatre. They pursue unsuspecting people in taxicabs, sit beside them in omnibuses. Above all, they take down speeches. In fact, the system is exactly like the secret police system of Russia. Mr. Pethick Lawrence and I spoke in our own defence, and Mr. Healy, M.P., defended Mrs. Pethick Lawrence. I cannot give our speeches in full, but I should like to include as much of them as will serve to make the entire situation clear to the reader. Mr. Lawrence spoke first at the opening of the case. He began by giving an account of the suffrage movement and why he felt the enfranchisement of women appeared to him a question so grave that it warranted strong measures in its pursuit. He sketched briefly the history of the Women's Social Political Union, from the time when Christabel Pankhurst and Annie Kenney were thrown out of Sir Edward Grey's meeting and imprisoned for asking a political question, to the torpedoing of the Conciliation Bill. "The case that I have to put before you," he said, "is that neither the conspiracy nor the incitement is ours, but that the conspiracy is a conspiracy of the Cabinet, who are responsible for the government of this country, and that the incitement is the incitement of the Ministers of the Crown." And he did this most effectually, not only by telling of the disgraceful trickery and deceit with which the Government had misled the suffragists in the matter of suffrage bills, but by giving the plain words in which the members of Cabinet had advised the women that they would never get the vote until they learned how to fight for it as men had fought in the past. When it came my turn to speak, realizing that the average man is profoundly ignorant of the history of the women's movement, because the press has never adequately or truthfully chronicled the movement, I told the jury, as briefly as I could, the story of 40 years' peaceful agitation before my daughters and I resolved that we would give our lives to the work of getting the vote for women, and that we should use whatever means of getting the vote that were necessary to success. "We founded the Women's Social and Political Union," I said, "in 1903. Our first intention was to try and influence the particular political party, which was then coming into power, to make this question of the enfranchisement of women their own question and to push it. It took some little time to convince us, and I need not weary you with the history of all that has happened, but it took some little time to convince us that that was no use, that we could not secure things in that way. Then in 1905 we faced the hard facts. We realized that there was a press boycott against women's suffrage. Our speeches at public meetings were not reported. Our letters to the editors were not published, even if we implored the editors. Even the things relating to women's suffrage in Parliament were not recorded. They said the subject was not of sufficient public interest to be reported in the press, and they were not prepared to report it. Then, with regard to the men politicians in 1905, we realized how shadowy were the fine phrases about democracy, about human equality, used by the gentlemen who were then coming into power. They meant to ignore the women. There was no doubt whatever about that. From the official documents coming from the Liberal party on the eve of the 1905 election, there were sentences like this: "What the country wants is a simple measure of manhood suffrage." There was no room for the inclusion of women. We knew perfectly well that if there was to be franchise reform at all, the Liberal party which was then coming into power did not mean votes for women, in spite of all the pledges of members, in spite of the fact that a majority of the House of Commons, especially on the Liberal side, were pledged to it. It did not mean that they were going to put it into practice. And so we found some way of forcing their attention to this question. Now I come to the facts with regard to militancy. We realized that the plans we had in our minds would involve great sacrifice on our part, that it might cost us all we had. We were at that time a little organization, composed in the main of working women, the wives and daughters of working men, and my daughters and I took a leading part, naturally, because we thought the thing out, and, to a certain extent, because we were of better social position than most of our members, and we felt a sense of responsibility. I described the events that marked the first days of our work, the scene in Free Trade Hall, Manchester, when my daughter and her companion were arrested for the crime of asking a question of a politician, and I continued, "What did they do next?" I want you to realize that no step we have taken forward has been taken until after some act of repression on the part of our enemy, the Government, because it is the Government that is our enemy. It is not the members of Parliament, it is not the men in the country, it is the Government in power alone that can give us the vote. It is the Government alone that we regard as our enemy, and the whole of our agitation is directed to bringing just as much pressure as necessary upon those people who can deal with our grievance. The next step the women took was to ask questions during the course of meetings, because, as I told you, these gentlemen gave them no opportunity of asking them afterwards.
And then began the interjections of which we have heard, the interference with the right to hold public meetings, the interference with the right of free speech, of which we have heard, for which these women, these hooligan women as they have been called, have been denounced. I ask you, gentlemen, to imagine the amount of courage which it needs for a woman to undertake that kind of work. When men come to interrupt women's meetings, they come in gangs, with noisy instruments, and sing and shout together, and stamp their feet. But when women have gone to Cabinet Ministers' meetings, only to interrupt Cabinet Ministers and nobody else, they have gone singly. And it has become increasingly difficult for them to get in, because as a result of the women's methods there has developed the system of admission by ticket, a thing in which my Liberal days would have been thought a very disgraceful thing at Liberal meetings. But this ticket system developed, and so the women could only get in with very great difficulty. Women have concealed themselves for 36 hours in dangerous positions, under the platforms, in the organs, wherever they could get a vantage point. They waited starving in the cold, sometimes on the roof exposed to a winter's night, just to get a chance of saying in the course of a Cabinet Minister's speech, "When is the Liberal Government going to put its promises into practice?" That has been the form militancy took in its further development. I went over the whole matter of our peaceful deputations, and of the violence with which they were invariably met, of our arrests and the farcical police court trials, where the mere evidence of a policeman's unsupported statement sent us to prison for long terms, of the falsehoods told of us in the House of Commons by responsible members of the Government, tales of women scratching and biting policemen and using hat-pins. And I accused the Government of making these attacks against women who were powerless to defend themselves, because they feared the women and desired to crush the agitation represented by our organization. Now it has been stated in this court, I said, that it is not the Women's Social and Political Union that is in the court, but that it is certain defendants. The action of the Government, gentlemen, is certainly against the defendants who are before you here today. But it is also against the Women's Social and Political Union. The intention is to crush that organization. And this intention apparently was arrived at after I had been sent to prison for 2 months for breaking a pane of glass worth, I am told, 2s. 3d. The punishment which I accepted because I was a leader of this movement, though it was an extraordinary punishment to inflict for so small an act of damages as I had committed. I accepted it as the punishment for a leader of an agitation disagreeable to the Government, and while I was there this prosecution started. They thought they would make a clean sweep of the people who they considered were the political brains of the movement. We've got many false friends in the Cabinet, people who by their words appear to be well-meaning toward the cause of women's suffrage, and they thought that if they could get the leaders of the Union out of the way it would result in the indefinite postponement and settlement of the question in this country. Well, they have not succeeded in their design, and even if they had got all the so-called leaders of this movement out of their way, they would not have succeeded even then. Now, why have they not put the Union on the dock? We have a democratic government so-called. This Women's Social and Political Union is not a collection of hysterical and unimportant wild women, as has been suggested to you, but it is an important organization, which numbers amongst its membership very important people. It is composed of women of all classes of the community, women who have influence in their particular organizations as working women, women who have influence in professional organizations as professional women, women of social importance, women even of royal rank are amongst the members of this organization, and so it would not pay a democratic government to deal with this organization as a whole. They hoped that by taking away the people that they thought guided the political fortunes of the organization, they would break the organization down. They thought that if they put out of the way the influential members of the organization, they, as one member of the Cabinet I believe said, would crush the movement and get it on the run. Well, governments have many times been mistaken, gentlemen, and I venture to suggest to you that governments are mistaken again. I think the answer to the Government was given at the Albert Hall meeting held immediately after our arrest. Within a few minutes, without the eloquence of Mrs. Pethick Lawrence, without the appeals of the people who have been called leaders of this movement, in a very few minutes £10,000 was subscribed for the carrying on of this movement. Now a movement like that, supported like that, is not a wild hysterical movement. It is not a movement of misguided people. It is a very serious movement. Women, I submit, like our members, and women, I venture to say, like the 2 women and like the man who are in the dock today, are not people to undertake a thing like this lightly. May I just try to make you feel what it is that has made this movement the gigantic size it is from the very small beginnings it had? It is one of the biggest movements of modern times. A movement which is not only an influence, perhaps not yet recognized in this country, but is influencing the women's movement all over the world. Is there anything more marvelous in modern times than the kind of spontaneous outburst in every country of this women's movement? Even in China, and I think it somewhat of a disgrace to Englishmen, even in China, women have won the vote, as an outcome of a successful revolution, with which, I dare say, members of His Majesty's Government sympathise. A bloody revolution. One more word on that point. When I was in prison the second time for 3 months as a common criminal for no greater offence than the issue of a handbill, less inflammatory in its terms than some of the speeches of members of the Government who prosecute us here, during that time, through the efforts of a Member of Parliament, there was secured for me permission to have the daily paper in prison, and the first thing I read in the daily press was this: that the Government was at that moment feting the members of the Young Turkish Revolutionary Party, gentlemen who had invaded the privacy of the Sultan's home. We used to hear a great deal about invading the privacy of Mr. Asquith's residence when we ventured to ring his doorbell. Gentlemen who had killed and slain, and had been successful in their revolution, while we women had never thrown a stone, for none of us was imprisoned for stone throwing, but merely for taking the part we had then taken in this organization. There we were imprisoned while these political murderers were being feted by the very Government who imprisoned us, and were being congratulated on the success of their revolution. Now I ask you, was it to be wondered at that women said to themselves, "Perhaps it is we have not done enough. Perhaps it is that these gentlemen do not understand womenfolk. Perhaps they do not realize women's ways, and because we have not done the things that men have done, they may think we are not in earnest." And then we come down to this last business of all, when we have responsible statesmen like Mr. Hobhouse saying there had never been any sentimental uprising, no expression of feeling like that which led to the burning down of Nottingham Castle. Can you wonder then that we decided we should have to nerve ourselves to do more, and can you understand why we cast about to find a way, as women will, that would not involve loss of human life and the maiming of human beings, because women care more about human life than men, and I think it is quite natural that we should, for we know what life costs. We risk our lives when men are born. Now, I want to say this deliberately, as a leader of this movement, we have tried to hold it back. We've tried to keep it from going beyond bounds, and I have never felt a prouder woman than I did one night when a police constable said to me, after one of these demonstrations, "Had this been a man's demonstration, there would have been bloodshed long ago." Well, my lord, there has not been any bloodshed except on the part of the women themselves, these so-called militant women. Violence has been done to us, and I who stand before you in this dock have lost a dear sister in the course of this agitation. She died within 3 days of coming out of prison, a little more than a year ago. These are things which, wherever we are, we do not say very much about. We cannot keep cheery, we cannot keep cheerful, we cannot keep the right kind of spirit, which means success, if we dwell too much upon the hard part of our agitation. But I do say this, gentlemen, that whatever in future you may think of us, you will say this about us, that whatever our enemies may say, we have always put up an honourable fight, and taken no unfair means of defeating our opponents, although they have not always been people who have acted so honourably towards us. We have assaulted no one, we have done no hurt to any one, and it was not until Black Friday, and what happened on Black Friday is that we had a new Home Secretary, and there appeared to be new orders given to the police, because the police on that occasion showed a kind of ferocity in dealing with the women that they had never done before, and the women came up to us and said, "We cannot bear this." It was not until then we felt this new form of repression should compel us to take another step. That is the question of Black Friday, and I want to say here and now that every effort was made after Black Friday to get an open public judicial inquiry into the doings of Black Friday as to the instructions given to the police. That inquiry was refused, but an informal inquiry was held by a man, whose name will carry conviction as to his status and moral integrity on the one side of the great political parties, and a man of equal standing on the Liberal side. These two men were Lord Robert Cecil and Mr. Ellis Griffith. They held a private inquiry, had women before them, took their evidence, examined that evidence, and after hearing it, said they believed that the women had told them was substantially true, and that they thought there was a good cause for that inquiry to be held. That was embodied in a report. To show you our difficulties, Lord Robert Cecil, in a speech at the Criterion Restaurant, spoke on this question. He called upon the Government to hold this inquiry, and not one word of that speech was reported in any morning paper. That is the sort of thing we have had to face, and I welcome standing here, if only for the purpose of getting these facts out, and I challenge the Attorney General to institute an inquiry into these proceedings, not that kind of inquiry of sending their inspectors to Holloway and accepting what they are told by the officials, but to open a public inquiry, with a jury if he likes, to deal with our grievances against the Government and the methods of this agitation. I say it is not the defendants who have conspired, but the Government who have conspired against us to crush this agitation. But however the matter may be decided, we are content to abide by the verdict of posterity. We are not the kind of people who like to brag a lot. We are not the kind of people who would bring ourselves into this position unless we were convinced that it was the only way. I have tried. All my life I have worked for this question. I have tried arguments, I have tried persuasion. I have addressed a greater number of public meetings perhaps than any person in this court, and I have never addressed one meeting where substantially the opinion of the meeting, not a ticket meeting, but an open meeting, for I have never addressed any other kind of meeting, has not been that where women bear burdens and share responsibilities like men, they should be given the privileges that men enjoy. I am convinced that public opinion is with us, that it has been stifled, wilfully stifled, so that in a public court of justice one is glad of being allowed to speak on this question. The Attorney General's summing up for the prosecution was very largely a defense of the Liberal party and its course in regard to women's suffrage legislation. Therefore, Mr. Tim Healey, in his defense of Mrs. Pethick Lawrence, did well to lay stress on the political character of the conspiracy charge and trial. He said, "It is no doubt a very useful thing when you have political opponents to be able to set the law in motion against them. I have not the smallest doubt it would be a very convenient thing, if they had the courage to do it, to shut up the whole of His Majesty's opposition while the present Government is in office, to lock up all the men of lustre and distinction in our public forum and on our public platforms, all the Carsons, F.E. Smiths, Bonar Laws, and so on. It would be a most convenient thing to end the whole thing, as it would be to end women's agitation in the form of the indictment. Gentlemen of the jury, whatever words have been spoken by mutual opponents, whatever instructions have been addressed, not to feeble females, but to men who boast of drilling and of arms, they have not had the courage to prosecute anybody, except women, by means of an indictment. Yet the Government of my learned friend have selected 2 dates as cardinal dates, and they ask you to pass judgment upon the prisoners at the bar, and to say that, without rhyme or reason, taking the course suggested without provocation, these responsible, well-bred, educated university people have suddenly, in the words of the indictment, wickedly and with malice aforethought engaged in these criminal designs. Gentlemen of the jury, the first thing I would ask in that connection is this. What is there in the course of this demand put forward by women which should have excited the treatment at the hands of His Majesty's ministers which this movement, according to the documents which are in evidence before me, has received? I should suppose that the essence of all government is the smooth conduct of affairs, so that those who enjoy high station, great emoluments, should not be parties against whom the accusation of provoking civic strife and breeding public turmoil should be brought. What do we find? We find that, in regard to the treatment of the demand which had always been put forward humbly, respectfully, respectably, and in its origin, by those who have received trade unionists, anti-vaccinators, deceased wives' sisters, and all other forms of political demand, and who have received them humbly and yielded to them, we find that when these people advocating this particular form of civic reform request an audience, request admission, request even to have their petitions respectfully received, they have met judicially, at all events, with a flat and solemn negative. That is the beginning of this unhappy spirit bred in the minds of persons like the defendants, persons like those against whom evidence has been tendered, which has led to your being impaneled in that box to-day. And I put it to you when you are considering whether it is the incitement of my clients or the conduct of ministers that have led to these events, whether I cannot ask you to say that even a fair appointment of blame should not rest upon more responsible shoulders, and whether you should go out of your way to say that these persons in the dock alone are guilty. In closing, Mr. Healey reverted to the political character of the trial. The Government have undertaken this prosecution, he declared, to seclude for a considerable period their chief opponents. They hope there will be at public meetings which they attend no more inconvenient cries of votes for women. I cannot conceive any other object which they could have in bringing the prosecution. I have expressed my regret at the loss which shopkeepers, tradesmen, and others have suffered. I regret it deeply. I regret that any person should bring loss or suffering upon innocent people. But I ask you to say that the law has already been sufficiently vindicated by the punishment of the immediate authors of the deed. What can be gained? Does justice gain? I almost hesitate to treat this as a legal inquiry. I regard it as a vindictive political act. Of all the astonishing acts that have ever been brought into a public court against a prisoner, I cannot help feeling the charge against Mr. Pethick Lawrence is the most astonishing. He ventured to attend at some police courts and give bail for women who had been arrested in endeavouring, as I understand, to present petitions to Parliament or to have resort to violence. I do not complain of the way in which my learned friend has conducted the prosecution, but I do complain of the police methods, inquiring into the homes and the domestic circumstances of the prisoners, obtaining their papers, taking their newspaper, going into their bank account, bringing up their bankers here to say what is their balance, and I do say that in none of the prosecutions of the past have smaller methods belittled a great state trial, because, look at it as you will, you cannot get away from it that it is a great state trial. It is not the women who are on trial, it is the men. It is the system of government which is upon trial. It is this method of rolling the dice by 54 counts in an indictment without showing to what any bit of evidence is fairly attributable. The system is on its trial. A system whereby every innocent act in public life is sought to be enmeshed in a conspiracy. The jury was absent for more than an hour, showing that they had some difficulty in agreeing upon a verdict. When they returned it was plain from their strained countenances that they were labouring under deep feeling. The foreman's voice shook as he pronounced the verdict, guilty as charged, and he had hard work to control his emotions as he added, "Your Lordship, we unanimously desire to express the hope that, taking into consideration the undoubtedly pure motives that underlie the agitation that has led to this trouble, you will be pleased to exercise the utmost clemency and leniency in dealing with the case." A burst of applause followed this plea. Then Mr. Pethick Lawrence arose and asked to say a few words before sentence was pronounced. He said that it must be evident, aside from the jury's recommendation, that we had been actuated by political motives, and that we were in fact political offenders. It had been decided in English courts that political offenders were different from ordinary offenders, and Mr. Lawrence cited the case of a Swiss subject whose extradition was refused because of the political character of his offence. The court on that occasion had declared that even if the crime were murder committed with a political motive, it was a political crime. Mr. Lawrence also reminded the judge of the case of the late Mr. W. T. Stead, convicted of a crime, yet because of the unusual motive behind the crime was allowed first division treatment and full freedom to receive his family and friends. Last of all, the case of Dr. Jameson was cited. Although his raid resulted in the death of 21 persons and the wounding of 46 more, the political character of his offence was taken into account and he was made a first division prisoner. They were men fighting in a man's war. We of the W.S.P.U. were women fighting in a women's war. Lord Coleridge, therefore, saw in us only reckless and criminal defiers of law. Lord Coleridge said, "You have been convicted of a crime for which the law would sanction, if I chose to impose it, a sentence of 2 years' imprisonment with hard labour. There are circumstances connected with your case which the jury have very properly brought to my attention, and I have been asked by you all three to treat you as first-class misdemeanants. If, in the course of this case, I had observed any contrition or disavowal of the acts you have committed, or any hope that you would avoid repetition of them in the future, I should have been very much prevailed upon by the arguments that have been advanced to me. No contrition having been expressed by us, the sentence of the court was that we were to suffer imprisonment, in the second division, for the term of 9 months, and that we were to pay the costs of the prosecution." End of Book 3, Chapter 2.
Book 3, Chapter 3 of My Own Story by Emmeline Pankhurst. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. The Women's Revolution, Chapter 3. The sentence of 9 months astonished us beyond measure, especially in view of certain very recent events, one of these being the case of some sailors who had mutinied in order to call attention to something which they considered a peril to themselves and to all seafarers. They were tried and found technically guilty, but because of the motive behind their mutiny were discharged without punishment. Perhaps more nearly like our case than this was the case of the Labour leader Tom Mann, who shortly before had written a pamphlet calling upon His Majesty's soldiers not to fire upon strikers when commanded to do so by their superior officers. From the government's point of view this was a much more serious kind of inciting than ours, because if it had been responded to, the authorities would have been absolutely crippled in maintaining order. Besides, soldiers who refuse to obey orders are liable to the death penalty. Tom Mann was given a sentence of 6 months, but this was received, on the part of the Liberal press and Liberal politicians, with so much clamour and protest that the prisoner was released at the end of 2 months. So even on our way to prison we told one another that our sentences could not stand. Public opinion would never permit the government to keep us in prison for 9 months, or in the second division for any part of our term. We agreed to wait 7 parliamentary days before we began a hunger strike protest. It was very dreary waiting, those 7 parliamentary days, because we could not know what was happening outside or what was being talked of in the House. We could know nothing of the protests and memorials that were pouring in on our behalf from Oxford and Cambridge universities, from members of learned societies, and from distinguished men and women of all professions, not only in England but in every country of Europe, from the United States and Canada, and even from India. An international memorial asking that we be treated as political prisoners was signed by such great men and women as Professor Paul Milyukov, leader of the Constitutional Democrats in the Duma, Signor Enrico Ferri of the Italian Chamber of Deputies, Edward Bernstein of the German Reichstag, George Brandes, Edward Westermarck, Madame Curie, Ellen Key, Maurice Maeterlinck, and many others. The greatest indignation was expressed in the House, Keir Hardie and Mr. George Lansbury leading in the demand for a drastic revision of our sentences and our immediate transference to the First Division. So much pressure was brought to bear that within a few days the Home Secretary announced that he felt it his duty to examine into the circumstances of the case without delay. He explained that the prisoners had not at any time been forced to wear prison clothes. Ultimately, which in this case means shortly before the expiration of the 7 parliamentary days, we were all 3 placed in the First Division. Mrs. Pethick Lawrence was given the cell formerly occupied by Dr. Jameson, and I had the cell adjoining. Mr. Pethick Lawrence in Brixton Jail was similarly accommodated. We all had the privilege of furnishing ourselves with comfortable chairs, tables, our own bedding, towels, and so on. We had meals sent in from the outside, we wore our own clothing and had what books, newspapers, and writing materials we required. We were not permitted to write or receive letters or to see our friends except in the ordinary 2 weeks' routine. Still we had gained our point that suffrage prisoners were politicals. We had gained it, but as it turned out, only for ourselves. When we made the inquiry, "Are all our women now transferred to the First Division?" the answer was that the order for transference referred only to Mr. and Mrs. Pethick Lawrence and myself. Needless to say, we immediately refused to accept this unfair advantage, and after we had exhausted every means in our power to induce the Home Secretary to give the other suffrage prisoners the same justice that we had received, we adopted the protest of the hunger strike. The word flew swiftly through Holloway, and in some mysterious way travelled to Brixton, to Aylesbury, and Winson Green, and at once all the other suffrage prisoners followed our lead. The Government then had over 80 hunger strikes on their hands, and as before had ready only the argument of force, which means that disgusting and cruel process of forcible feeding. Holloway became a place of horror and torment. Sickening scenes of violence took place almost every hour of the day, as the doctors went from cell to cell performing their hideous office. One of the men did his work in such brutal fashion that the very sight of him provoked cries of horror and anguish. I shall never while I live forget the suffering I experienced during the days when those cries were ringing in my ears. In her frenzy of pain, one woman threw herself from the gallery on which her cell opened. A wire netting 8 feet below broke her fall to the iron staircase beneath, else she must inevitably have been killed. As it was, she was frightfully hurt. The wholesale hunger strike created a tremendous stir throughout England, and every day in the House the ministers were harassed with questions. The climax was reached on the 3rd or 4th day of the strike, when a stormy scene took place in the House of Commons. The Under Home Secretary, Mr. Ellis Griffith, had been mercilessly questioned as to conditions under which the forcible feeding was being done, and as soon as this was over one of the suffragist members made a moving appeal to the Prime Minister himself to order the release of all the prisoners. Mr. Asquith, forced against his will to take part in the controversy, rose and said that it was not for him to interfere with the actions of his colleague, Mr. McKenna, and he added, in his own suave, mendacious manner, "I must point out this, that there is not one single prisoner who cannot go out of prison this afternoon on giving the undertaking asked for by the Home Secretary," meaning an undertaking to refrain henceforth from militancy. Instantly Mr. George Lansbury sprung to his feet and exclaimed, "You know they cannot. It is perfectly disgraceful that the Prime Minister of England should make such a statement." Mr. Asquith glanced carelessly at the indignant Lansbury, but sank into his seat without deigning to reply. Shocked to the depths of his soul by the insult thrown at our women, Mr. Lansbury strode up to the ministerial bench and confronted the Prime Minister, saying again, "That was a disgraceful thing for you to say, sir. You are beneath contempt, you and your colleagues. You call yourselves gentlemen, and you forcibly feed and murder women in this fashion. You ought to be driven out of office. Talk about protesting. It is the most disgraceful thing that ever happened in the history of England. You will go down to history as the men who tortured innocent women." By this time the House was seething, and the indignant Labour member had to shout at the top of his big voice in order to be heard over the din. Mr. Asquith's pompous order that Mr. Lansbury leave the House for the day was probably known to very few until it appeared in print the next day. At all events, Mr. Lansbury continued his protest for 5 minutes longer. "You murder, torture, and drive women mad," he cried, "and then you tell them they can walk out. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. You talk about principle, you talk about fighting in Ulster, you, too," turning to the Unionist benches, "you ought to be driven out of public life. These women are showing you what principle is. You ought to honour them for standing up for their womanhood. I tell you, Commons of England, you ought to be ashamed of yourself." The Speaker came to Mr. Asquith's rescue at last and adjured Mr. Lansbury that he must obey the Prime Minister's order to leave the House, saying that such disorderly conduct would cause the House to lose respect. "Sir," exclaimed Mr. Lansbury in a final burst of righteous rage, "it has lost it already." This unprecedented explosion of wrath and scorn against the Government was the sensation of the hour, and was felt on all sides that the release of the prisoners, or at least cessation of forcible feeding, which amounted to the same thing, would be ordered. Every day the Suffragettes marched in great crowds to Holloway, serenading the prisoners and holding protest meetings to immense crowds. The music and the cheering, faintly wafted to our straining ears, was inexpressibly sweet. Yet it was while listening to one of these serenades that the most dreadful moment of my imprisonment occurred. I was lying in bed, very weak from starvation, when I heard a sudden scream from Mrs. Lawrence's cell, then the sound of a prolonged and very violent struggle, and I knew that they had dared to carry their brutal business to our doors. I sprang out of bed, and shaking with weakness and with anger, I set my back against the wall and waited for what might come. In a few moments they had finished with Mrs. Lawrence and had flung open the door to my cell. On the threshold I saw the doctors, and back of them a large group of wardresses. "Mrs. Pankhurst," began the doctor. Instantly I caught up a heavy earthenware water jug from a table hard by, and with hands that now felt no weakness, I swung the jug head high. "If any of you dares so much as to take one step inside this cell, I shall defend myself," I cried. Nobody moved or spoke for a few seconds, and then the doctor confusedly muttered something about tomorrow morning doing as well, and they all retreated. I demanded to be admitted to Mrs. Lawrence's cell, where I found my companion in a desperate state. She is a strong woman, and a very determined one, and it had required the united strength of 9 wardresses to overcome her. They had rushed into the cell without any warning, and seized her unawares, else they might not have succeeded at all. As it was, she resisted so violently that the doctors could not apply the stethoscope, and they had very great difficulty in getting the tube down. After the wretched affair was over, Mrs. Lawrence fainted, and for hours afterward was very ill. This was the last attempt made to forcibly feed either Mrs. Lawrence or myself, and 2 days later we were ordered released on medical grounds. The other hunger strikers were released in batches, as every day a few more triumphant rebels approached the point where the Government stood in danger of committing actual murder. Mr. Lawrence, who was forcibly fed twice a day for more than 10 days, was released in a state of complete collapse on July 1st. Within a few days after that the last of the prisoners were at liberty. As soon as I was sufficiently recovered I went to Paris and had the joy of seeing again my daughter Christabel, who during all of the days of strife and misery had kept her personal anxiety in the background and had kept staunchly at her work of leadership. The absence of Mr. and Mrs. Pethick Lawrence had thrown the entire responsibility of the editorship of our paper, Votes for Women, on her shoulders, but as she has invariably risen to meet new responsibility, she conducted the paper with skill and discretion. We had much to talk about and to consider, because it was evident that militancy, instead of being dropped, as the other suffrage societies were constantly suggesting, must go on very much more vigorously than before. The struggle had been too long drawn out. We had to seek ways to shorten it, to bring it to such a climax that the Government would acknowledge that something had to be done. We had already demonstrated that our forces were impregnable. We could not be conquered, we could not be terrified, we could not even be kept in prison. Therefore, since the Government had their war lost in advance, our task was merely to hasten the surrender. The situation in Parliament, as far as the suffrage question was concerned, was clean swept and barren. The third Conciliation Bill had failed to pass its second reading, the majority against it being 14. Many Liberal members were afraid to vote for the bill because Mr. Lloyd George and Mr. Lewis Harcourt had persistently spread the rumour that its passage at that time would result in splitting the Cabinet. The Irish Nationalist members had become so hostile to the bill because their leader, Mr. Redmond, was an anti-suffragist, and had refused to include a women's suffrage clause in the House Rule Bill. Our erstwhile friends, the Labour members, were so apathetic, or so fearful for certain of their own measures, that most of them stayed away from the House on the day the bill reached its second reading. So it was lost, and the militants were blamed for its loss. In June the Government announced that Mr. Asquith's manhood suffrage bill would soon be introduced, and very soon after this bill did appear. It simplified the registration machinery, reduced the qualifying period of residence to 6 months, and abolished property qualifications, plural voting, and university representation. In a word, it gave the parliamentary franchise to every man above the age of 21 and denied it to all women.
Never in the history of the suffrage movement had such an affront been offered to women, and never in the history of England had such a blow been aimed at women's liberties. It is true that the Prime Minister had pledged himself to introduce a bill capable of being amended to include women's suffrage, and to permit any amendment that passed at second reading to become a part of the bill. But we had no faith in an amendment, nor in any bill that was not from its inception an official government measure. Mr. Asquith had broken every pledge he had ever made to the women, and this new pledge impressed us not at all. Well we knew that he had given it only to cover his treachery in torpedoing the Conciliation Bill, and in the hope of placating the suffragists, perhaps securing another truce to militancy. If this last was his hope, he was most grievously disappointed. Signs were constantly appearing to indicate that women would no longer be contented with the symbolic militancy involved in window breaking. For example, traces were found in the House Secretary's office at Whitehall of an attempted arson. On the doorstep of another cabinet minister similar traces were found. Had the government acted upon these warnings, by giving women the vote, all the serious acts of militancy that have occurred since would have been averted. But like the heart of Pharaoh, the heart of the government hardened, and militant acts followed one after another in rapid succession. In July, the WSPU issued a manifesto which set forth our intentions in that regard. The manifesto read in part as follows: The leaders of the Women's Social and Political Union have so often warned the government that unless the vote were granted to women in response to the mild militancy of the past, a fiercer spirit of revolt would be awakened which it would be impossible to control. The government have blindly disregarded the warning, and now they are reaping the harvest of their unstatesmanlike folly. This was issued immediately after a visit paid by Mr. Asquith to Dublin. The occasion had been intended to be one of great pomp and circumstance, a huge popular demonstration in honour of the sponsor of the Home Rule, but the suffragettes turned it into the most lamentable fiasco imaginable. From the hour of Mr. Asquith's attempted secret departure from London until his return he lived and moved in momentary dread of suffragettes. Every time he entered or left a railway carriage or a steamer he was confronted by women. Every time he rose to speak he was interrupted by women. Every public appearance he made was turned into a riot by women. As he left Dublin a woman threw a hatchet into his motor car, without however doing him any injury. As a final protest against his reception by Irishmen, the Theatre Royal was set on fire by 2 women. The theatre was practically empty at the time, the performance having been completed, and the damage done was comparatively small, yet the 2 women chiefly concerned, Mrs. Lee and Miss Evans, were given the barbarous sentences of 5 years each in prison. These were the first women sentenced to penal servitude in the history of our movement. Of course they did not serve their sentences. On entering Mountjoy prison they put in the usual claim for first division treatment, and this being refused they immediately adopted the hunger strike. A number of Irish suffragettes were in Mountjoy at this time for a protest made against the exclusion of women from the Home Rule Bill. They were in the first division and they were almost on the eve of their release, but such is the indomitable spirit of militancy that these women entered upon a sympathetic hunger strike. They were released, but the government forbade the release of Mrs. Lee and Miss Evans. That is, they ordered the authorities to retain the women as long as they could, by forcible feeding, be kept alive. After a struggle which, for fierceness and cruelty, is almost unparalleled in our annals, the 2 women fought their way out. All during that summer militancy surged up and down throughout the kingdom. A series of attacks on golf links was instituted, not at all in a spirit of wanton mischief, but with the direct and very practical object of reminding the dull and self-satisfied English public that when the liberties of English women were being stolen from them was no time to think of sports. The women selected country clubs where prominent Liberal politicians were wont to take their week-end pleasures, and with acids they burned great patches of turf, rendering the golf greens useless for the time being. They burned the words "Votes for Women" in some cases, and always they left behind them reminders that women were warring for their freedom. On one occasion, when the court was at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, the suffragettes invaded the royal golf links, and when Sunday morning dawned all the marking flags were found to have been replaced by WSPU flags, bearing inscriptions such as "Votes for Women means peace for ministers," "Forcible feeding must be stopped," and the like. The golf links were frequently visited by suffragettes in order to question recreant ministers. 2 women followed the Prime Minister to Inverness, where he was playing golf with Mr. McKenna. Approaching the men, one suffragette exclaimed, "Mr. Asquith, you must stop forcible feeding." She got no farther, for Mr. Asquith, turning pale with rage, perhaps, retreated behind the Home Secretary, who, quite forgetting his manners, seized the suffragette, crying out that he was going to throw her into the pond. "Then we will take you with us," the 2 retorted, after which a very lively scuffle ensued, and the women were not thrown into the pond. This golf green activity really aroused more hostility against us than all the window breaking. The papers published appeals to us not to interfere with a game that helped weary politicians to think clearly, but our reply to this was that it had not any such effect on the Prime Minister or on Mr. Lloyd George. We had undertaken to spoil their sport, and that of a large class of comfortable men, in order that they should be obliged to think clearly about women, and women's firm determination to get justice. I made my return to active work in the autumn by speaking at a great meeting of the W.S.P.U. held in the Albert Hall. At that meeting I had the announcement to make that the 6 years' association of Mr. and Mrs. Pethick Lawrence with the W.S.P.U. had ended. Since personal dissensions have never been dwelt upon in the W.S.P.U., have never been allowed to halt the movement or to interfere for an hour with its progress, I shall not here say any more about this important dissension than I said at our first large meeting in Albert Hall after the holiday, on October 17th. That day a new paper was sold on the streets. It was called The Suffragette. It was edited by Emmeline Pankhurst, and was henceforth to be the official organ of the Union. Both in this new paper and in the Votes for Women the following announcement appeared: Grave statements by the leaders. At the first reunion of the leaders after the enforced holiday, Mrs. Pankhurst and Miss Christabel Pankhurst outlined a new militant policy which Mr. and Mrs. Pethick Lawrence found themselves altogether unable to approve. Mrs. Pankhurst and Miss Christabel Pankhurst indicated that they were not prepared to modify their intentions, and recommended that Mr. and Mrs. Pethick Lawrence should resume control of the paper, Votes for Women, and should leave the Women's Social and Political Union. Rather than make the schism in the ranks of the Union, Mr. and Mrs. Pethick Lawrence consented to take this course. This was signed by all four. That night at the meeting I further explained to the members that, hard as partings from old friends and comrades unquestionably were, we must remember that we were fighting in an army, and that unity of purpose and unity of policy are absolutely necessary, because without them the army is hopelessly weakened. It is better, I said, that those who cannot agree, cannot see eye to eye as to policy, should set themselves free, should part, and should be free to continue their policy as they see it in their own way, unfettered by those with whom they can no longer agree. Continuing, I said, I give place to none in appreciation and gratitude to Mr. and Mrs. Pethick Lawrence for the incalculable services that they have rendered in the militant movement for women's suffrage, and I firmly believe that the women's movement will be strengthened by their being free to work for women's suffrage in the future as they think best, while we of the Women's Social and Political Union shall continue the militant agitation for women's suffrage initiated by my daughter and myself and a handful of women more than 6 years ago. I then went on to survey the situation in which the W.S.P.U. now stood, and to outline the new militant policy which we had decided upon. This policy, to begin with, was relentless opposition, not only to the party in power, the Liberal Party, but to all parties in the coalition. I reminded the women that the government had tricked and betrayed us and was now plotting to make our progress towards citizenship doubly difficult, was kept in office through the coalition of three parties. There was the Liberal Party, nominally the governing party, but they could not live another day without the coalition of the Nationalist and Labour parties. So we should say, not only to the Liberal Party, but to the Nationalist Party and the Labour Party, so long as you keep in office an anti-suffrage government, you are parties to their guilt, and from henceforth we offer you the same opposition which we give to the people whom you are keeping in power with your support. I said further, we have summoned the Labour Party to do their duty by their own programme and to go into opposition to the government on every question until the government do justice to women. They apparently are not willing to do that. Some of them tell us that other things are more important than the liberty of women, than the liberty of working women. We say, then, gentlemen, we must teach you the value of your own principles, and until you are prepared to stand for the right of women to decide their lives and the laws under which they shall live, you, with Mr. Asquith and company, are equally responsible for all that has happened and is happening to women in this struggle for emancipation. Outlining further our new and stronger policy of aggression, I said, there is a great deal of criticism, ladies and gentlemen, of this movement. It always seems to me when the anti-suffrage members of the government criticize militancy in women that it is very like beasts of prey reproaching the gentler animals who turn in desperate resistance when at the point of death. Criticism from gentlemen who do not hesitate to order our armies to kill and slay their opponents, who do not hesitate to encourage party mobs to attack defenseless women in public meetings, criticism from them hardly rings true. Then I get letters from people who tell me they are ardent suffragists, but who say that they do not like the recent developments in the militant movement, and implore me to urge members not to be reckless with human life. Ladies and gentlemen, the only recklessness the militant suffragists have shown about human life has been about their own lives, and not about the lives of others. And I say here and now that it has never been and never will be the policy of the Women's Social and Political Union recklessly to endanger human life. We leave that to the enemy. We leave that to the men in their warfare. It is not the method of women. No, even from the point of view of public policy, militancy affecting the security of human life would be out of place. There is something that governments care for far more than human life, and that is the security of property, and so it is through property that we shall strike the enemy.
From henceforward the women who agree with me will say, we disregard your laws, gentlemen, we set the liberty and dignity and the welfare of women above all such considerations, and we shall continue this war as we have done in the past, and what sacrifice of property or what injury to property accrues will not be our fault. It will be the fault of that government who admit the justice of our demands, but refuses to concede them without the evidence, so they have told us, afforded to governments of the past, that those who asked for liberty were earnest in their demands. I called upon the women of the meeting to join me in this new militancy, and I reminded them anew that the women who were fighting in the suffragette army had a great mission, the greatest mission the world has ever known, the freeing of one half of the human race, and through that freedom the saving of the other half. I said to them, be militant each in your own way. Those of you who can express your militancy by going to the House of Commons and refusing to leave without satisfaction, as we did in the early days, do so. Those of you who can express militancy by facing party mobs at cabinet ministers' meetings, when you remind them of their falseness to principle, do so. Those of you who can express your militancy by joining us in our anti-government by-election policy, do so. Those of you who can break windows, break them. Those of you who can still further attack the secret idol of property, so as to make the government realize that property is as greatly endangered by women's suffrage as it was by the cherishes of old, do so. And my last word is to the government. I incite this meeting to rebellion. I say to the government, you have not dared to take the leaders of Ulster for their incitement to rebellion. Take me if you dare, but if you dare I tell you this, that so long as those who incited to armed rebellion and the destruction of human life in Ulster are at liberty, you will not keep me in prison. So long as men, rebels, and voters are at liberty, we will not remain in prison, First Division or no First Division. I ask my readers, some of whom will no doubt be shocked and displeased at these words of mine that I have so frankly set down, to put themselves in the place of those women who for years had given their lives entirely and unstintingly to the work of securing political freedom for women, who had converted so great a proportion of the electorate that, had the House of Commons been a free body, we should have won that freedom years before, who had seen their freedom withheld from them through treachery and misuse of power. I ask you to consider that we had used in our agitation only peaceful means until we saw clearly that peaceful means were absolutely of no avail, and then for years we had used only the mildest militancy, until we were taunted by cabinet ministers and told that we should never get the vote until we employed the same violence that men had used in their agitation for suffrage. After that we had used stronger militancy, but even that, by comparison with the militancy of men in labor disputes, could not possibly be counted as violent. Through all the stages of our agitation we had been punished with the greatest severity, sent to prison like common criminals, and of late years tortured as no criminals had been tortured for a century in civilized countries of the world. And during all these years we had seen disastrous strikes that had caused suffering and death, to say nothing at all of the enormous economic waste, and we had never seen a single strike leader punished as we had been. We, who had suffered sentences of 9 months' imprisonment for inciting women to mild rebellion, had seen a labor leader who had done his best to incite an army to mutiny released from prison in 2 months by the government. And now we had come to a point where we saw civil war threatened, where we read in the papers every day reports of speeches 1,000 times more incendiary than anything we had ever said. We heard prominent members of Parliament openly declaring that if the Home Rule Bill was passed, Ulster would fight, and Ulster would be right. None of these men were arrested. Instead, they were applauded. Lord Selborne, one of our sternest critics, referring to the fact that Ulster men were drilling under arms, said publicly, "The method which the people of Ulster are adopting to show the depths of their convictions and intensity of their feelings will impress the imagination of the whole country." But Lord Selborne was not arrested. Neither were the mutinous officers who resigned their commissions when ordered to report for duty against the men of Ulster who were actually preparing for a civil war. What does all this mean? Why is it that men's bloodshedding militancy is applauded, and women's symbolic militancy punished with a prison cell and the forcible feeding horror? It means simply this, that men's double standard of sex morals, whereby the victims of their lust are counted as outcasts, while the men themselves escape all social censure, really applies to morals in all departments of life. Men make the moral code, and they expect women to accept it. They have decided that it is entirely right and proper for men to fight for their liberties and their rights, but that it is not right and proper for women to fight for theirs. Footnote: There is no question that a great deal of the animus directed at us during 1913 and 1914 by the government was due to sex bitterness stirred up by a series of articles written by Emmeline Pankhurst and published in the Suffragette. These articles, a fearless and authoritative exposé of the evils of sexual immoralities and their blasting effect on innocent wives and children, have since been published in a book called The Great Scourge and How to End It, issued by David Nutt, New Oxford Street, London, W.C. End footnote. They have decided that for men to remain silently quiescent while tyrannical rulers impose bonds of slavery upon them is cowardly and dishonorable, but that for women to do that same thing is not cowardly and dishonorable, but merely respectable. Well, the suffragettes absolutely repudiate that double standard of morals. If it is right for men to fight for their freedom, and God knows what the human race would be like today if men had not, since time began, fought for their freedom, then it is right for women to fight for their freedom and the freedom of the children they bear. On this declaration of faith, the militant women of England rest their case. End of Book 3, Chapter 3. Book 3, Chapter 4 of My Own Story by Emmeline Pankhurst. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. The Women's Revolution, Chapter 4. I had called upon women to join me in striking the government through the only thing that governments are really very much concerned about, property, and the response was immediate. Within a few days the newspapers rang with the stories of the attack made on letter boxes in London, Liverpool, Birmingham, Bristol, and half a dozen other cities. In some cases the boxes, when opened by postmen, mysteriously burst into flame; in others the letters were destroyed by corrosive chemicals; in still others the addresses were rendered illegible by black fluids. Altogether it was estimated that over 5,000 letters were completely destroyed and many thousands more were delayed in transit. It was with a deep sense of their gravity that these letter-burning protests were undertaken, but we felt that something drastic must be done in order to destroy the apathy of the men of England who view with indifference the suffering of women oppressed by unjust laws. As we pointed out, letters, precious though they may be, are less precious than human bodies and souls. This fact was universally realized at the sinking of the Titanic. Letters and valuables disappeared forever, but their loss was forgotten in the far more terrible loss of the multitude of human lives. And so, in order to call attention to greater crimes against human beings, our letter burnings continued. In only a few cases were the offenders apprehended, and one of the few women arrested was a helpless cripple, a woman who could move about only in a wheelchair. She received a sentence of 8 months in the First Division, and resolutely hunger striking, was forcibly fed with unusual brutality, the prison doctor deliberately breaking one of her teeth in order to insert a gag. In spite of her disabilities and her weakness, the crippled girl persisted in her hunger strike and her resistance to prison rules, and within a short time had to be released. The excessive sentences of other pillar box destroyers resolved themselves into very short terms because of the resistance of the prisoners, every one of whom adopted the hunger strike. Having shown the government that we were in deadly earnest when we declared that we would adopt guerrilla warfare, and also that we would not remain in prison, we announced a truce in order that the government might have full opportunity to fulfil their pledge in regard to a woman suffrage amendment to the franchise bill. We did not, for one moment, believe that Mr. Asquith would willingly keep his word. We knew that he would break it if he could, but there was a bare chance that he would not find this possible. However, our principal reason for declaring the truce was that we believed that the Prime Minister would find a way of evading his promise, and we were determined that the blame should be placed, not on militancy, but on the shoulders of the real traitor. We reviewed the history of past suffrage bills. In 1908 the bill had passed its second reading by a majority of 179, and then Mr. Asquith had refused to allow it to go on. In 1910 the Conciliation Bill passed its second reading by a majority of 110, and again Mr. Asquith blocked its progress, pledging himself that if the bill were reintroduced in 1911, in a form rendering it capable of free amendment, it would be given full facilities for becoming law. These conditions were met in 1911, and we saw how the bill, after receiving an increased majority of 167 votes, was torpedoed by the introduction of a Government Manhood Suffrage Bill. Mr. Asquith this time had pledged himself that the bill would be so framed that a woman suffrage amendment could be added, and he further pledged that in case such an amendment was carried through to its second reading, he would allow it to become part of the bill. Just exactly how the government would manage to wriggle out of their promise was a matter of excited speculation. All sorts of rumours were flying about, some hinting at the resignation of the Prime Minister, some suggesting the possibility of a general election, others that the amended bill would carry with it a forced referendum on women's suffrage. It was also said that the intention of the government was to delay the bill so long that after it was passed in the House it would be excluded from the benefits of Parliament Acts, according to which a bill, delayed of passage beyond the first 2 years of the life of a Parliament, has no chance of being considered by the Lords. In order to become a law without the sanction of the House of Lords, a bill must pass 3 times through the House of Commons. The prospect of a woman suffrage bill doing that was practically nil. To none of the rumors would Mr. Asquith give a specific denial, and in fact the only positive utterance he made on the subject of the franchise bill was that he considered it highly improbable that the House would pass a women's suffrage amendment. In order to discourage women's suffrage sentiment in the House, Mr. Lloyd George and Mr. Lewis Harcourt again busied themselves with spreading pessimistic prophecies of a cabinet split in case an amendment was carried. No other threat, they well knew, would so terrorize the timid back-bench Liberals, who, in addition to their blind party loyalty, stood in fear of losing their seats in the general election which would follow such a split. Rather than risk their political jobs, they would have sacrificed any principle. Of course, the hint of a cabinet split was pure buncombe, and it deceived few of the members. But it established very clearly one thing, and this was that Mr. Asquith's promise that the House should be left absolutely free to decide the suffrage issue, and that the Cabinet stood ready to bow to the decision of the House, was never meant to be fulfilled. The franchise bill, unamended, by its very wording, specifically denied the right of any woman to vote. Sir Edward Grey moved an amendment deleting from the bill the word male, thus leaving room for a women's suffrage amendment. Two such amendments were moved, one providing for adult suffrage for men and women, and the other providing full suffrage for women householders and wives of householders. The latter postponed the voting age of women to 25 years instead of the men's 21. On January 24, 1913, debate on the first of the amendments was begun. A day and a half had been allotted to consideration of Sir Edward Grey's amendment, which if carried would leave the way clear for consideration of the other two, to each of which 1/3 of a day was allotted. We had arranged for huge meetings to be held every day during the debates, and on the day before they were to open we sent a deputation of working women, led by Mrs. Drummond and Miss Annie Kenney, to interview Mr. Lloyd George and Sir Edward Grey. We had asked Mr. Asquith to receive the deputation, but, as usual, he refused. The deputation consisted of the two leaders, 4 cotton mill operatives from Lancashire, 4 workers in sweated trades of London, 2 pit brow lassies, 2 teachers, 2 trained nurses, 1 shop assistant, 1 laundress, 1 boot and shoe worker, and 1 domestic worker, 20 in all, the exact number specified by Mr. Lloyd George. Some hundreds of working women escorted the deputation to the official residence of the Chancellor of the Exchequer and waited anxiously in the street to hear the result of the audience. The result was, of course, barren. Mr. Lloyd George glibly repeated his confidence in the great opportunity afforded by the franchise bill, and Sir Edward Grey, reminding the women of the divergence of view held by the members of the Cabinet on the suffrage question, assured them that their best opportunity for success lay in an amendment to the present bill. The women spoke with the greatest candour to the two ministers and questioned them sharply as to the integrity of the Prime Minister's pledge to accept the amendments if passed. To such depth of infamy had English politics sunk that it was possible for women to openly question the plighted word of the King's chief minister. Mrs. Drummond, who stands in awe of no human being, in plain words invited the slippery Mr. Lloyd George to clear his own character from obloquy. In the closing words of her speech she put the whole matter clearly up to him, saying, "Now, Mr. Lloyd George, you have doggedly stuck to your old age pensions and the Insurance Act and secured them, and what you have done for these measures you can also do for the women." The House met on the following afternoon to debate Sir Edward Grey's permissive amendment, but no sooner had the discussion opened than a veritable bombshell was cast into the situation. Mr. Bonar Law rose and asked for a ruling on the constitutionality of a women's suffrage amendment to the bill as framed. The Speaker, who besides acting as the presiding officer of the House is its official parliamentarian, replied that in his opinion such an amendment would make a huge difference in the bill, and that he would be obliged, at later stages of the debates, to consider carefully whether, if carried, any women's suffrage amendment would not so materially alter the bill that it would have to be withdrawn. In spite of this sinister pronouncement, the House continued to debate the Grey amendment, which was ably supported by Lord Hugh Cecil, Lord John Rolleston, and others. During the intervening week-end holiday 2 Cabinet councils were held, and when the House met on Monday the Prime Minister called upon the Speaker for his ruling. The Speaker declared that in his opinion the passage of any one of the women's suffrage amendments would so alter the scope of the franchise bill as practically to create a new bill, because the measure, as it was framed, did not have for its main object the bestowal of the franchise on a hitherto excluded class. Had it been so framed, a woman's suffrage amendment would have been entirely proper. But the main object of the bill was to alter the qualification or basis of registration for a parliamentary vote. It would increase the male electorate, but only as an indirect result of the changed qualifications. An amendment to the bill removing the sex barrier from the election laws was not, in the Speaker's opinion, a proper one. The Prime Minister then announced the intentions of the Cabinet, which were to withdraw the franchise bill and to refrain from introducing during that session a plural voting bill. Mr. Asquith blandly admitted that his pledge in regard to women's suffrage had been rendered incapable of fulfilment, and he said that he felt constrained to give a new pledge to take its place. There were only two that could be given. The first was that the Government should bring in a bill to enfranchise women, and this the Government would not do. The second was that the Government agreed to give full facilities as to time, during the next session of Parliament, to a private member's bill so drafted as to be capable of free amendment. This was the course that the Government had decided to adopt. Mr. Asquith had the effrontery to say in conclusion that he thought that the House would agree that he had striven and had succeeded in giving effect, both in letter and in spirit, to every undertaking which the Government had given. Two members only, Mr. Henderson and Mr. Keir Hardie, had the courage to stand up on the floor of the House and denounce the Government's treachery, for treachery it unquestionably was. Mr. Asquith had pledged his sacred honour to introduce a bill that would be capable of an amendment to include women's suffrage, and he had framed a bill that could not be so amended. Whether he had done the thing deliberately, with the plain intention of selling out the women, or whether ignorance of parliamentary rules accounted for the failure of the bill, was immaterial. The bill need not have been drawn in ignorance. The fount of wisdom represented by Mr. Speaker could have been consulted at the time the bill was under construction quite as easily as when it had reached the debating stage. Our paper said editorially, representing and perfectly expressing our members' views, either the Government are so ignorant of parliamentary procedure that they are unfit to occupy any position of responsibility, or else they are scoundrels of the worst kind. I am inclined to think that the verdict of posterity will lean toward the later conclusion. If Mr. Asquith had been a man of honour, he would have reframed the franchise bill in such a way that it could have included a suffrage amendment, or else he would have made amends for his stupendous blunder, if it was a blunder, by introducing a Government measure for women's suffrage. He did neither, but disposed of the matter by promising facilities for a private member's bill which he knew, and which everybody knew, could not possibly pass. There was no chance for a private member's bill, even with facilities, because of a number of reasons, but principally because the torpedoing of the Conciliation Bill had destroyed utterly the spirit of conciliation in which Conservatives, Liberals, and Radicals in the House of Commons, and militant and non-militant women throughout the kingdom had set aside their differences of opinion and agreed to come together on a compromise measure. When the second Conciliation Bill of 1911 was under discussion, Lord Lytton had said, "If this bill does not go through, the women's suffrage movement will not be stopped, but the spirit of conciliation of which this bill is an expression will be destroyed, and there will be war throughout the country, raging, tearing, fierce, bitter strife, though nobody wants it." Lord Lytton's words were prophetic. At this last brazen piece of trickery on the part of the Government, the country blazed with bitter wrath. All the suffrage societies united in calling for a Government measure for women's suffrage to be introduced without delay. The idle promise of facilities for a private member's bill was rejected with contumely and scorn. The Liberal Women's Executive Committee met, and a strong effort was made to pass a resolution threatening the withdrawal from party work of the entire Federation, but this failed, and the Executive merely passed a feeble resolution of regret. The membership of the Women's Liberal Federation was, at that time, close to 200,000, and if the Executive had passed the strong resolution, refusing to do any more work for the party until a Government measure had been introduced, the Government would have been forced to yield. They could not have faced the country without the support of the women. But these women, many of them, were wives of men in the service, the paid service of the Liberal party. Many of them were wives of Liberal members. They lacked the courage, or the intelligence, or the insight to declare war as a body on the Government. A large number of women, and also many men, did resign from the Liberal party, but the defections were not serious enough to affect the Government. The militants declared and proceeded instantly to carry out unrelenting warfare. We announced that either we must have a Government measure, or a Cabinet split, those men in the Cabinet calling themselves suffragists going out, or we would take up the sword again, never to lay it down until the enfranchisement of the women of England was won. It was at this time, February, 1913, less than 2 years ago as I write these words, that militancy as it is now generally understood by the public began. Militancy in the sense of continued destructive guerrilla warfare against the Government through injury to private property. Some property had been destroyed before this time, but the attacks were sporadic and were meant to be in the nature of a warning as to what might become a settled policy. Now we indeed lighted the torch, and we did it with the absolute conviction that no other course was open to us. We had tried every other measure, as I am sure that I have demonstrated to my readers, and our years of work and suffering and sacrifice had taught us that the Government would not yield to right and justice, what the majority of the members of the House of Commons admitted was right and justice, but that the Government would, as other governments invariably do, yield to expediency. Now our task was to show the Government that it was expedient to yield to the women's just demands. In order to do that we had to make England and every department of English life insecure and unsafe. We had to make English law a failure and the courts farce comedy theatres. We had to discredit the Government and Parliament in the eyes of the world. We had to spoil English sports, hurt business, destroy valuable property, demoralize the world of society, shame the churches, upset the whole orderly conduct of life. That is, we had to do as much of this guerrilla warfare as the people of England would tolerate.
When they came to the point of saying to the government, "Stop this," in the only way that it can be stopped, by giving the women of England representation, then we should extinguish our torch. Americans of all people ought to see the logic of our reasoning. There is one piece of American oratory, beloved of schoolboys, which has often been quoted from militant platforms. In a speech now included among the classics of the English language, your great statesman Patrick Henry summed up the causes that led to the American Revolution. He said, "We have petitioned, we have remonstrated, we have supplicated, we have prostrated ourselves at the foot of the throne, and it has all been in vain. We must fight. I repeat, sir, we must fight." Patrick Henry, remember, was advocating killing people, as well as destroying private property, as the proper means of securing the political freedom of men. The suffragettes have not done that, and they never will. In fact, the moving spirit of militancy is deep and abiding reverence for human life. In the latter course of our agitation I have been called upon to discuss our policies with many eminent men, politicians, literary men, barristers, scientists, clergymen. One of the last named, a high dignitary in the Church of England, told me that while he was a convinced suffragist he found it impossible to justify our doing wrong that right might follow. I said to him, we are not doing wrong. We are doing right in our use of revolutionary methods against private property. It is our work to restore thereby true values, to emphasize the value of human rights against property rights. You are well aware, sir, that property has assumed a value in the eyes of men, and in the eyes of the law, that it ought never to claim. It is placed above all human values. The lives and health and happiness, and even the virtue of women and children, that is to say the race itself, are being ruthlessly sacrificed to the God of property every day of the world. To this my reverend friend agreed, and I said, if we women are wrong in destroying private property in order that human values may be restored, then I say, in all reverence, that it was wrong of the founder of Christianity to destroy private property, as he did when he lashed the money changers out of the temple and when he drove the Gadarene swine into the sea. It was absolutely in this spirit that our women went forth to war. In the first month of guerrilla warfare an enormous amount of property was damaged and destroyed. On January 31st a number of putting greens were burned with acids. On February 7th and 8th telegraph and telephone wires were cut in several places, and for some hours all communication between London and Glasgow was suspended. A few days later windows in various of London's smartest clubs were broken, and the orchid houses at Kew were wrecked and many valuable blooms destroyed by cold. The Jewel Room at the Tower of London was invaded and a showcase broken. The residence of His Royal Highness Prince Christian and Lambeth Palace, seat of the Archbishop of Canterbury, were visited and had windows broken. The refreshment house in Regent's Park was burned to the ground on February 12th, and on February 18th a country house which was being built at Walton on the Hill for Mr. Lloyd George was partially destroyed, a bomb having been exploded in the early morning before the arrival of the workmen. A hat pin and a hair pin picked up near the house, coupled with the fact that care had been taken not to endanger any lives, led police to believe that the deed had been done by women enemies of Mr. Lloyd George. 4 days later I was arrested and brought up in Epsom Police Court, where I was charged with having counselled and procured the persons who did the damage. Admitted to bail for the night, I appeared the next morning in court, where the case was fully reviewed. Speeches of mine were read, one speech, made at a meeting held on January 22nd, in which I called for volunteers to act with me in a particular engagement, and another, made the day after the explosion, in which I publicly accepted responsibility for all militant acts done in the past, and even for what had been done at Walton. At the conclusion of the hearing I was committed for trial at the May Assizes at Guildford. Bail would be allowed, it was stated, if I would agree to give the usual undertaking to refrain from all militancy or incitement to militancy. I asked that the case be set for speedy trial at the Assizes then in progress. I was entirely willing, I said, to give an undertaking for a short period, for a week or even 2 weeks, but I could not possibly do so for a much longer period, looking at the fact that a new session of Parliament began in March, and was vitally concerned with the interests of women. The request was refused, and I was ordered to be taken to Holloway. I warned the magistrate that I should at once adopt the hunger strike, and I told him that if I lived at all until the summer it would be a dying woman who would come up for trial. Arriving at Holloway I carried out my intentions, but within 24 hours I heard that the authorities had arranged that my trial should take place on April 1st instead of at the end of June, and at the Central Criminal Court, London, instead of the Guildford Court. I then gave the required undertakings, and was immediately released on bail. End of Book 3, Chapter 4.